Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Sleepless Dossier, the only place where history keeps you up at night. Today we're pulling the curtain back on the Cambodian genocide, but not the version you think you know. We're going deeper, into the dark corridors of geopolitical power where the decisions that enabled the killing fields were made. This isn't just about the Khmer Rouge. It's about the hidden patrons, the silent partners, and the global complicity that allowed it to happen. The true history they don't want you to know is a global game of chicken, played with real bombs, fake smiles, and millions of lives treated as collateral damage. It's a story so tangled with betrayal and cynicism that it's frankly, and I mean this seriously, depressing to its core, but the truth often is. Before we dive into the inevitable betrayals and double crosses, if you appreciate us digging up the facts that keep historians awake, please hit that like and subscribe. It ensures these secrets keep finding their way into the light. All right, dim the lights. This one gets messy. To understand the inferno, you must first understand the man who fiddled while the kindling was being laid. His name was Prince Norodom Sihanouk, and he was the living embodiment of Cambodia's fatal paradox. In the grand theater of the Cold War, Sihanouk cast himself as the serene, neutralist leader of a peaceful Buddhist kingdom, a delicate lotus blossom floating above the muddy waters of superpower conflict. This was his brand, his international calling card. He produced films starring himself, held jazz sessions, and projected an image of a benevolent, almost divine father of his nation. It was a masterful performance, and it was a complete and utter lie. The official narrative of Cambodian neutrality in the 1950s and 60s is a fiction, a carefully constructed myth designed to obscure a frantic, high-stakes double game that would directly lead to the nation's immolation. Sihanouk wasn't a neutralist. He was a political survivalist of the highest order, ruling over a nation wedged between the American-backed regimes in Thailand and South Vietnam on one side, and the rising tide of North Vietnamese communism on the other. Neutrality wasn't a philosophy. It was a desperate balancing act on a razor's edge, and Sihanouk's method was to make secret, contradictory promises to everyone, while publicly accepting millions in American economic and military aid that propped up his corrupt government and kept his army loyal. He was privately cutting deals with the other side. In 1965, he made a secret pact with China, S. Zhou Enlai, and North Vietnam, S. Pham Van Dong. The terms were simple and catastrophic. Sihanouk would allow North Vietnamese Army, NVA, and Viet Cong, VC forces to establish permanent bases and supply lines deep inside Cambodian territory. The port of Sihanoukville would become a primary conduit for war materiel shipped from China and the Soviet Union, which was then trucked along what became known as the Sihanouk Trail to communists fighting the Americans in South Vietnam. This was the ultimate hypocrisy. While Sihanouk was denouncing American imperialism from the podiums of the United Nations, his own country was actively serving as the logistical rear guard for Hanoi's war effort. He had transformed his neutral kingdom into an undeclared and indispensable participant in the Vietnam War. He wasn't keeping the wolves from the door. He had secretly invited two rival packs into the henhouse, hoping they would be too busy watching each other to devour him. He believed he was manipulating them, that his royal charisma and diplomatic cunning could keep these apex predators in check indefinitely. It was a fatal miscalculation, born of an ego that could not comprehend its own irrelevance in the grand scheme of things. Washington, of course, was not blind. Intelligence reports from the CIA and MACV-SOG reconnaissance teams detailed the vast NVA-VC presence in Cambodia's eastern provinces. The neutral border was a joke, a porous line on a map that meant nothing to the thousands of enemy troops sheltering there. The absurdity of the situation is best captured in a sentiment that circulated among the diplomatic corps in Phnom Penh, a piece of gallows humor that was closer to prophecy. Let's call it our first uncomfortable quote, from a French attaché observing the prince in his prime. The prince believes he is the ringmaster of a circus featuring two tigers, one American and one Chinese. He cracks the whip, and they jump. What he fails to understand is that the tigers are not looking at him. They are looking at each other through the bars of his cage, and the cage itself is growing weaker by the day. That quote nails the terrifying reality of Sihanouk's position. He saw himself as the master of ceremonies, but in reality, he was merely the proprietor of the arena. His secret deals created a shadow state within his own borders, a vast network of communist sanctuaries that Cambodia's own army was forbidden to enter. This de facto ceding of sovereignty was the original sin from which all other horrors would flow. It gave North Vietnam a vested interest in keeping Cambodia weak and compliant. It gave the United States a legitimate, if secret, justification to eventually start bombing Cambodian territory, an act that would have devastating consequences. And most critically, it created a power vacuum in the countryside, a chaotic and ungoverned space, where a fledgling ultra-Maoist insurgency could fester and grow, feeding on the resentment of a rural populace that saw their prince aligning himself with their historic enemies, the Vietnamese. And this is the first devastating long-term consequence of the lie of neutrality. Sihanouk's double-dealing didn't save Cambodia, it hollowed it out from the inside. By trying to be everything to everyone, he made his nation a battleground by invitation. He thought he was playing chess, but he and his people were merely the squares on the board upon which a much larger, more brutal game was being played. The path to the killing fields didn't begin in 1975 with the fall of Phnom Penh. It began a decade earlier with a series of cynical handshakes in foreign capitals, where a prince traded away his country's soul for the illusion of security, ensuring that when the final bill came due, it would be paid in the blood of his own people. That chaotic, ungoverned space created by Sihanouk's disastrous double game became the perfect petri dish for a political virus to grow. But this contagion wasn't indigenous. It wasn't born of the soil or the suffering of the Cambodian peasant, as its eventual purveyors would claim in their blood-soaked propaganda. No, the intellectual seeds for Cambodia's wholesale destruction were imported. They were cultivated thousands of miles away, not in dusty villages or humid rice paddies, but in the smoke-filled cafes, university lecture halls, and radical political salons of post-war Paris. The men who would orchestrate one of the most brutal revolutions in human history were not farmers. They were the pampered sons of the Cambodian elite, sent to the heart of the colonial empire to be educated, and instead became radicalized. Meet the Paris Student Group, the future brain trust of the Angkar, the mysterious and murderous organization that would rule Cambodia. There was Khieu Samphan, the brilliant economist who would write a doctoral thesis arguing for Cambodia's complete economic self-sufficiency, a theory that sounded plausible on paper and would become a blueprint for mass starvation in practice. There was Yang Sari, the charming and sociable student who would later become the regime's foreign minister, its smiling public face while bodies piled up at home. And then there was the quiet, unassuming man studying radio electronics, a man who consistently failed his exams, a man named Salath Sar. You know him better as Pol Pot. These were not downtrodden revolutionaries rising from oppression. They were privileged scholarship students breathing the heady intellectual air of a France grappling with its own colonial legacy and infatuated with Marxism. They joined the French Communist Party, they read Stalin and Mao, and they formed a secret Marxist study group, the Cercle Marxiste. Here, in the heart of Western civilization, they became obsessed with destroying it. They absorbed a particularly rigid, dogmatic, and unforgiving version of communism, one that was utterly divorced from the Cambodian reality of Buddhism, monarchy, and village life. Their revolutionary fervor was an abstraction, a theory of power learned from books, not from people. They came to believe that Cambodia's problems, its corruption under Sihanouk, its economic backwardness, its cultural subservience, could only be solved by a complete and total reset. Not reform, but erasure. They developed a profound contempt for their own culture, seeing it as tainted and impure. The cities were parasitic, intellectuals were traitors, family bonds were a bourgeois weakness, and religion was an opiate. It was all a cancer that needed to be surgically, brutally excised from the body politic so that a new, pure, agrarian society could be born. This was the Year Zero concept in its embryonic form, conceived not by peasants but by Parisian intellectuals who romanticized a peasant life they had never lived and fundamentally despised. The French authorities, of course, were keeping tabs on these radical students from their colonies. But their assessment, filtered through a lens of imperial arrogance, failed catastrophically to grasp the danger. It's easy to imagine the sort of report that would have landed on a desk at the STCE, the French Foreign Intelligence Service. It's the kind of document that, in hindsight, is chilling in its naivety. Our classified memo for today is a reconstruction of that fatal misjudgment. From STI's Directorate of Colonial Affairs to Minister of the Interior. Subject: Surveillance of Circle Marxiste, Cambodian Student Faction. Assessment: the group comprises approximately 24 Cambodian nationals centered around figures like Ieng Sari and Saloth Sar. Their rhetoric is standard, third-worldist anti-colonialism, heavily influenced by Stalinist doctrine acquired through the French Communist Party. They are doctrinaire, academically rigid, and almost entirely disconnected from the political realities within Cambodia itself. Their ideology is a purely intellectual exercise. Threat level: negligible. They are more likely to author unread political pamphlets than to foment genuine revolution. They lack charisma, practical skills, and any tangible connection to the Cambodian populace. Recommend continued low-level monitoring, but they pose no credible threat to French interests or the stability of the Sihanouk regime. No credible threat. That is the devastating irony. The West saw them as deluded armchair revolutionaries, failing to understand that the most dangerous men are not those who crave money or power in its traditional sense, but those who are possessed by an idea that reclassifies millions of human beings as obstacles, as impurities to be cleansed. These were not politicians. They were ideologues, and their return to Cambodia in the 1960s was like the introduction of a laboratory-engineered virus into a vulnerable ecosystem. They burrowed into the nascent communist movement, outmaneuvering the more moderate pro-Vietnamese communists, and slowly, patiently, seizing control of the party apparatus. They went into the jungles, taking their Parisian theories with them, ready to impose their abstract utopia onto the real world. And here is the grim, overarching consequence of this Parisian education. It guaranteed the unique cruelty of the revolution to come. Because their ideology was a foreign import, completely alien to the culture it sought to command, it could not persuade or evolve. It could only command and purify. The Khmer Rouge leadership was fundamentally disconnected from the people they claimed to be liberating. They weren't solving Cambodia's problems. They were solving theoretical problems from Marxist textbooks. When the Cambodian people, with their loyalties to family, religion, and tradition, did not conform to the sterile, theoretical model of the new man they had designed, the answer wasn't to change the model. The answer was to eliminate the people. This intellectual arrogance, born in Paris, is the key that unlocks the seemingly incomprehensible madness of the killing fields. It wasn't madness at all. It was the logical, monstrous conclusion of a bad idea, pursued with absolute, unblinking conviction. When this cadre of Parisian-educated ideologues returned to Cambodia, they found a communist movement already in progress, but it was a movement largely under the thumb of North Vietnam. It was cautious, pragmatic, and saw the Cambodian struggle as secondary to the main event, the war against the Americans and the unification of Vietnam. Into this environment stepped Saloth Sar, the failed electronics student. On the surface, he was the least impressive of the Paris group. He took a job as a history and geography teacher at a private school, living a quiet, unassuming life. He was described as charming, gentle, and softly spoken. It was the perfect cover for the methodical, ruthless political operator lurking just beneath the surface. While Sihanouk was playing his high-wire act and the Americans were escalating their involvement in Vietnam, Saloth Sar was playing a much longer, deadlier game inside the Cambodian revolutionary underground. His transformation from mediocre teacher to Pol Pot, the architect of genocide, was not a matter of destiny or evil genius. It was a calculated ascent to power, fueled by a potent mix of paranoia, nationalist fervor, and most importantly, the patronage of a foreign superpower looking for a pawn. Saloth Sar and his faction were deeply, almost pathologically anti-Vietnamese. They viewed the Vietnamese communists not as brothers in arms, but as historical enemies who sought to dominate Cambodia, using the shared struggle of communism as a tool of imperialism. This deeply ingrained suspicion became their defining characteristic and, critically, their most valuable asset in the eyes of another larger player on the board, Mao Zedong's China. The growing schism between the Soviet Union and China had created a bitter rivalry that rippled across the communist world. Vietnam, while trying to balance the two, was leaning ever closer to Moscow. For Beijing, this was an unacceptable threat on their southern flank. They needed a counterweight, a proxy, a loyal ally in Southeast Asia that would be reliably anti-Soviet and therefore anti-Vietnamese. In the mid-1960s, Saloth Sar made a series of secret journeys that would alter the course of his nation's history. He first went to Hanoi, seeking support and recognition as the leader of the Cambodian party. He was treated like a provincial subordinate. The Vietnamese leadership lectured him, urging patience and subservience to their own war effort. They saw him as rash, his ultra-radical ideas as dangerous and impractical. But then, he traveled to Beijing, and there, he was welcomed as a true revolutionary comrade. He met with high-ranking officials of the Chinese Communist Party, who saw in his fierce nationalism and radical Maoist rhetoric a perfect reflection of their own cultural revolution. Here was a man untainted by Soviet revisionism or Vietnamese pragmatism. Here was a man who hated Hanoi as much as they did. China gave Saloth Sar the one thing Vietnam would not: ideological validation. They anointed him and his radical, Paris-educated faction as the sole legitimate revolutionary force in Cambodia. This political backing was more valuable than 1,000 guns. It gave him the authority to return to Cambodia and begin purging the party of all pro-Vietnamese elements, consolidating his absolute control. The Vietnamese, for their part, saw the writing on the wall. They knew a dangerous force had been unleashed, one that was being fed and encouraged by their rivals in Beijing. We can find a record of their alarm in the archives, a warning that went unheeded. Let's frame it as our uncomfortable. Quote a reconstructed fragment from a Vietnamese Workers' Party internal debrief after Saloth Sar's visit. Comrade Sar speaks not with the voice of a fellow revolutionary, but with the arrogance of a student who has read one book too many. He rejects our experience, our struggle. His mind is filled with the slogans of the great helmsman from the north, but he shows no understanding of the practical realities of our situation. He distrusts us. In his eyes, we are not comrades, but occupiers in waiting. He is a Khmer nationalist first, a communist, a distant second. This will be a problem for us, and a tragedy for his people. A tragedy for his people. Never have truer words been spoken in a back room. The foreign backing from China was the catalyst that transformed Saloth Sar from a factional leader into the undisputed chief of a newly christened Communist Party of Kampuchea, the Khmer Rouge. This wasn't just a quiet endorsement. Chinese advisors and trainers began to appear. The ideological poison of the Cultural Revolution, with its emphasis on purging intellectuals, destroying tradition, and a cult of personality, flowed directly into the Khmer Rouge's veins. Pol Pot wasn't just an imitator of Mao. He was a chosen disciple, tasked with creating a super-Maoist state on China's southern border. And this reveals the crucial, terrifying consequence. The very nature of the Khmer Rouge was forged by this specific international patronage. Their decision to align with China against Vietnam guaranteed that their revolution would be defined by paranoia and bloodshed. The first enemies they liquidated were not Sihanouk soldiers or the bourgeoisie of Phnom Penh. It was their own communist comrades who had ties to Vietnam. The party was purified in a series of brutal internal purges long before they ever seized state power. This established the model for their rule: constant paranoid searching for internal enemies, the equation of any dissent with foreign conspiracy, and the use of mass murder as a primary tool of political consolidation. China didn't just bankroll a monster, it actively shaped the specific features of that monster to suit its own geopolitical needs. They empowered the most extreme, xenophobic and murderous faction of the Cambodian left because that faction served a purpose in their great game against Vietnam and the Soviet Union. The killing fields were not an accident. They were the direct, predictable result of a mediocre teacher being given a foreign license to kill. While Pol Pot was securing his ideological backing from Beijing, his Khmer Rouge movement remained a marginal force on the ground in Cambodia. They were a few thousand strong at best, a collection of jungle-based ideologues with grand theories and very little popular support. To the average Cambodian rice farmer, their Parisian-forged doctrines were alien and irrelevant. Sihanouk, for all his faults, was still the God King. The communists were a fringe threat. For Pol Pot's revolution to ignite, it needed fuel. It needed a catalyst so profound, so terrifying, that it would shatter the traditional structures of Cambodian society and drive a traumatized, vengeful populace into his arms. That catalyst would not come from China or Vietnam. It would be delivered unwittingly from 30,000 feet in the air by the United States Air Force. In March 1969, President Richard Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, made a fateful and illegal decision. Frustrated by the flow of North Vietnamese troops and supplies through the Cambodian sanctuaries, the very sanctuaries Prince Sihanouk had secretly approved, they authorized a massive, covert bombing campaign. It was codenamed Operation Menu, and its targets were inside a nation with which the United States was officially at peace. To conceal this act of war from the American public, Congress, and the world, an elaborate system of deception was created. B-52 Stratofortress crews would fly their missions, drop tons of explosives on Cambodia, and then their reports would be systematically falsified to indicate the strikes had occurred over South Vietnam. It was a conspiracy at the highest levels of the U.S. government, a secret war justified by the cold logic of Cold War necessity. The mission code names were a study in grotesque bureaucratic cynicism: breakfast, lunch, snack, dinner, supper, dessert. For over a year, American bombers relentlessly pounded the Cambodian countryside. The official objective was to destroy NVA and VC command centers. But B-52s are not surgical instruments. They are tools of carpet bombing, designed to obliterate square-kilometer grids of territory. The bombs rained down on jungle bases, but they also rained down on villages, on farms, on civilians who had no idea why their world was being set on fire. The scale is difficult to comprehend. Over 100,000 tons of bombs were dropped during Operation Menu alone, and the bombing would be expanded and continued for years, ultimately dropping more tonnage on Cambodia than the Allies dropped on Japan during all of World War II. It created a refugee crisis, displaced millions, and turned the eastern half of the country into a crater-pocked moonscape. American officials saw this as a painful but necessary military calculation. On the ground, however, intelligence operatives were sending back chilling reports about the unintended consequences. The bombs were not just destroying enemy supply lines, they were destroying the very fabric of Cambodian society, and in doing so, creating a new, far more dangerous enemy. The view from the ground was one of pure, unadulterated horror, a horror that was being expertly exploited. A glimpse into this reality can be found in our classified memo for this section, a reconstructed field report from a CIA officer to his station chief in Saigon. Subject: Strategic blowback from B-52 strikes in Kampong Cham province. Analysis: While the bombing runs are tactically disruptive to NVA-VC logistics, they are proving to be a strategic catastrophe for local hearts and minds. The insurgents, Khmer Rouge, are capitalizing on the aftermath of every strike. Their propaganda is simple and brutally effective. Cadres move into a bombed village, help gather the dead, and tell the survivors that the prince in Phnom Penh has allied himself with the Americans who rain fire from the sky. They paint the city dwellers and the government as complicit in this slaughter. We are no longer just fighting the Vietnamese in Cambodia. We are actively manufacturing a new indigenous enemy. Every bomb crater is a recruitment poster for Pol Pot. We are not eliminating communists. We are creating them out of whole cloth. This memo captures the devastating truth. The Khmer Rouge's message had previously been abstract and confusing to the peasantry, but after the bombing it became terrifyingly simple. They could walk into a devastated village, stand in the ruins of a home, and say to the survivors, "The city, the government, the Americans, they did this to you. We, the Ankar, are the only ones who can protect you. We are the only ones who can bring you justice and revenge. It was the single greatest gift the United States could have possibly given to Pol Pot. The bombing campaign validated their entire worldview. It proved their paranoid claims that the outside world was a malevolent force bent on destroying the true Khmer people. It transformed them from a fringe group of foreign-educated radicals into a legitimate army of national liberation in the eyes of a growing number of Cambodians. This is the ultimate sickening consequence of Operation Menu. In its obsessive, secret pursuit of victory in Vietnam, the Nixon administration created the conditions for a genocide in Cambodia. The campaign of terror from the sky severed the Cambodian peasant, his historical bond to the monarchy and the state. It radicalized a generation, breeding a desire for vengeance that the Khmer Rouge were perfectly positioned to harness. The young, traumatized and angry farm boys who filled the ranks of the Khmer Rouge army in the early 1970s weren't fighting for a Parisian Marxist ideology they couldn't comprehend. They were fighting out of rage. Rage against the planes that appeared without warning. Rage against the distant, corrupt government that couldn't protect them. Rage against a world that had turned their lives into a living hell. The United States thought it was fighting one war, but with every bomb it dropped, it was fueling the fires of a much darker, more absolute conflict to come. This campaign of American aerial terror did more than just radicalize the Cambodian countryside. It fatally destabilized the government in Phnom Penh. Prince Sihanouk's delicate balancing act had finally collapsed. The secret deal he made to harbor the North Vietnamese had invited American bombs, and those bombs were now fueling an insurgency led by Pol Pot's fanatics. The Cambodian economy was in shambles, and the urban elite, the generals, businessmen, and aristocrats who had long profited from Sihanouk's rule, were growing terrified. They saw the prince as a reckless gambler who had bet the entire country and lost. He had failed to keep the war in Vietnam from spilling over, and he had failed to protect them from the consequences. His authority was evaporating with every B-52 sortie. The ringmaster had lost control of the Tigers, and now they were tearing his circus apart. In March 1970, while Sihanouk was on a trip abroad, visiting Moscow and Beijing in a desperate attempt to get them to rein in their Vietnamese allies, the trap was sprung. His own prime minister, the staunchly anti-communist General Lon Nol, and his cousin, the pro-American Prince Sirik Matak, seized power in a swift, bloodless coup. The official narrative, the one you'll find in sanitized textbooks, is that this was a purely domestic affair. It was the Cambodian National Assembly, fed up with Sihanouk's corruption and his catastrophic foreign policy, voting him out of power. It was a patriotic act to save the nation from communism and Vietnamese encroachment. This is, at best, a convenient half-truth. The reality is far more sinister. The Lon Nol coup wasn't just a domestic power grab. It was an operation that had received a clear, unmistakable, if plausibly deniable, green light from Washington. The United States government had grown weary of Sihanouk's duplicity. Nixon and Kissinger wanted a reliable partner in Phnom Penh, a client who would not only stop sheltering the NVA, but would actively help the US fight them. Lon Nol was that client. For months leading up to the coup, American military intelligence and CIA contacts had been in communication with the plotters. While there is no declassified smoking gun document that explicitly orders the overthrow, the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. The United States knew the coup was coming. The US Embassy in Phnom Penh did nothing to warn Sihanouk, their official diplomatic partner. When the coup happened, Washington extended diplomatic recognition to the new Khmer Republic with almost unseemly speed. It was a textbook case of superpower maneuvering. You don't have to light the fire yourself if you've already supplied the fuel and matches and made it clear you to look the other way when the house burns down. The cold, pragmatic calculus behind this decision is the kind of thing that never makes it into public press conferences. It's the logic of the back room, of the secret briefing, of a policy decided in the shadows. We can imagine the conversation, the realpolitik stripped bare of all moral pretense. This is our uncomfortable quote for today, the voice of cynical power, a reconstructed sentiment from a high-level National Security Council meeting. Let's be clear for the official record, we did not engineer this. We did not give a direct order. However, we have been signaling for months that Sihanouk's neutrality was no longer tenable. We created the conditions where a move like this became not only possible, but necessary for the nationalist elements in his government. We saw the train coming down the tracks, and we simply declined to stand in its way. Sihanouk was an unreliable variable. Lon Nol is a potential asset. Our job now is not to question the coup's origin, but to exploit the opportunity it presents to the fullest. Exploit the opportunity, and they did. American money and military aid began to pour into Lon Nol's new government. But this American solution was the very thing that doomed the nation to an immediate, full-scale civil war. Sihanouk, for all his monstrous flaws, was the one figure who commanded a semblance of national unity, especially among the rural peasantry who viewed him as a semi-divine father figure. By overthrowing him, Lon Nol and his American patrons shattered that unity forever. The coup was the final fatal polarization of Cambodian society. There was no middle ground left. You were either with Lon Nol's corrupt American-backed republic in the cities, or you were against it. And this is the coup's most catastrophic, world-altering consequence. From his exile in Beijing, a furious and humiliated Sihanouk did the unthinkable. He made a deal with the devil. He announced his official support for the very people who had been his sworn enemies for years, the Khmer Rouge. He urged the Cambodian people, his children, to go into the jungle and join the fight against the usurper, Lon Nol. Overnight, this act transformed Pol Pot's movement. They were no longer just a fringe group of communist radicals. They were now the armed wing of a royalist government in exile, fighting under the legitimate banner of the beloved prince. The floodgates opened. Thousands of rural Cambodians who didn't know or care about Marxism-Leninism, but who loved their prince and hated the new government, flocked to join the Khmer Rouge, the American-backed coup, designed to create a more effective anti-communist force, had instead given the communists the greatest recruiting tool imaginable: the credibility of the crown. It was the ultimate act of geopolitical self-sabotage, an intervention that didn't prevent a disaster but guaranteed a holocaust. The American-backed coup in Phnom Penh sent shockwaves across the region, and nowhere were they felt more acutely than in Beijing. From Mao Zedong's perspective, the situation was a complex disaster. A pro-American government had just sprung up on China's southern periphery, a clear strategic negative. But the more immediate problem was that the new civil war in Cambodia was a conflict that North Vietnam, their communist rival, was perfectly positioned to dominate. The Vietnamese had thousands of troops already inside Cambodia and deep, long-standing ties to the Cambodian communist movement. A successful resistance against Lon Nol, led by Hanoi, would result in a Cambodia that was little more than a Vietnamese satellite state, a pawn of their Soviet-aligned competitors. For China, this was an existential threat. They could not allow the entire Indo-Chinese peninsula to fall under the sway of a unified, powerful Vietnam backed by Moscow. The coup, therefore, wasn't just a crisis. It was a moment of supreme geopolitical opportunity. And at that exact moment, the key to unlocking that opportunity literally fell out of the sky and into their laps. Prince Norodom Sihanouk, deposed and enraged, landed in Beijing looking for a patron. He was a king without a kingdom, a man with a famous name and a burning desire for revenge. To the master geopolitical strategist in the Chinese government like Premier Zhou Enlai, Sihanouk was not a deposed monarch to be pitied. He was a priceless asset to be leveraged. They now held the one man whose name could grant legitimacy to an anti-Lon Nol resistance. The Chinese calculus was as brilliant as it was pathologically cynical. They would build a resistance movement for Sihanouk, but they would ensure that its heart, its spine, and its teeth all belonged to their own carefully selected proxies: Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. This was Beijing's first major investment, not of money or arms just yet, but of political capital and strategy. They orchestrated a shotgun wedding. In the grand state halls of Beijing, they brought together the God King Sihanouk and the very Maoist fanatics who had sworn to destroy the monarchy he represented. The result was the formation of a government in exile with the grand-sounding name of Grunk, the Royal Government of National Union of Kampuchea. On the surface, it was a broad front of national unity. Sihanouk was the head of state. Respected moderates and royalists were given cabinet posts. But the real power, the command of the military forces on the ground, the CPNLF, or Cambodian People's National Liberation Armed Forces, was quietly handed over to the Khmer Rouge leadership. Khieu Samphan was named Minister of Defense. Pol Pot remained in the shadows, the ultimate authority. It was a perfect Chinese-engineered puppet show. Sihanouk was the marketable, internationally recognized face of the resistance, while Pol Pot's hardened ideologues would serve as the fist. The sheer, breathtaking cynicism of this arrangement cannot be overstated. China was simultaneously propping up a royal government while ensuring its eventual destruction by the very communists they placed in charge of its army. Premier Zhou Enlai, a man renowned for his sophisticated and utterly ruthless pragmatism, understood the paradox perfectly. It was a temporary necessary fiction. The true objective was not to restore Sihanouk, but to use him to install their own clients. A sentiment from a man like Zhou, in a closed-door meeting, would have been brutally honest. It is our uncomfortable quote: "The prince is the face. Pol Pot is the fist." For now, we need the prince's name to open the doors of international diplomacy and rally the peasants. He is the flag. But a flag cannot win a war. The war will be won by the disciplined comrades on the ground. Once the door is open and the house is ours, the utility of the prince will have reached its natural conclusion. Flags can be changed. Flags can be changed. In that one phrase lies the entire Chinese strategy. They were playing a long game. Their quiet initial investment was to create a political vehicle that could challenge both the Americans and the Vietnamese for control of Cambodia as destiny. By placing the Khmer Rouge at the core of the GRUNC, they were incubating their own proxy force inside a larger, more palatable host organism. This move allowed them to begin funneling support, advice, training, and eventually weapons, not to a fringe communist insurgency, but to a legitimate government in exile, led by a world-renowned prince. It was political laundering on a global scale. The devastating long-term consequence of this Chinese gambit was that it gave the Khmer Rouge a mask of respectability they could never have achieved on their own. It allowed them to present themselves to the world, and more importantly to the Cambodian people, as patriotic royalists, not as the bizarre Paris-educated Maoist cult they actually were. This deception was crucial to their growth. The GRUNC was recognized by China, North Vietnam, and a host of non-aligned nations. The aid flowed. The recruits poured in. China's calculated first move didn't just support the Khmer Rouge, it created them as a credible political and military force. They took a small band of genocidal ideologues, wrapped them in the national flag, and handed them the keys to a kingdom, all to place their own chess piece on the board and checkmate their rivals in Hanoi. The road to year zero was now officially paved with Beijing's geopolitical ambitions. While Beijing was playing its grand geopolitical game, using princes and communists as interchangeable pieces on a chessboard, one of those pieces believed he was actually the one playing the game. Prince Norodom Sihanouk, installed in a lavish state villa in the Chinese capital, was not a reluctant partner in this unholy alliance. He was an enthusiastic, if utterly deluded, participant. For Sihanouk, the pact with his mortal enemies, the Khmer Rouge, was not a surrender or a compromise. It was a masterstroke of political expediency, a cynical marriage of convenience that he was convinced he controlled. His motivations had nothing to do with ideology and everything to do with two primal forces: a bottomless well of personal vanity and a burning, all-consuming desire for revenge against Lon Nol. Sihanouk had spent 2 decades cultivating a cult of personality, positioning himself as the indispensable father of the nation, a semi-divine figure without whom Cambodia could not exist. The coup was not just a political act. It was a profound personal insult, a rejection of his very being. From his gilded cage in Beijing, he launched a furious propaganda campaign. Using a radio station provided by the Chinese, he broadcast impassioned appeals to his children, the Cambodian people, urging them to rise up and join the jungle resistance against the traitors in Phnom Penh. In his mind, the logic was simple and irrefutable. The Cambodian peasants loved him, their god king. The Khmer Rouge were a small, insignificant band of ideologues. Therefore, the army that was now forming was his army. The revolution being waged was his revolution. He patronizingly referred to them as Mes Khmer Rouges, my red Khmers, as if they were a personal possession, a tool he had picked up to reclaim his palace. This was a delusion of epic, history-altering proportions. Sihanouk genuinely believed that once victory was achieved, he would return to Phnom Penh in triumph, and the uneducated peasant communists would gratefully hand him back his crown. He would then discard them, as he had discarded so many allies before. He fundamentally misunderstood the nature of his new partners. He saw them as simple nationalists, when in fact they were hardened, ideologically possessed fanatics who viewed him and everything he represented, the monarchy, Buddhism, foreign influence, urban life, as a cancer to be eradicated. While Sihanouk was hosting banquets for foreign diplomats in Beijing, Pol Pot's cadres on the ground in Cambodia were already beginning the silent, methodical work of hijacking his revolution. They welcomed the Sihanouk loyalists, known as the Khmer Rouge, into their ranks, and then, in areas they controlled, they began to systematically purge them. They indoctrinated new recruits not with loyalty to the prince, but with absolute obedience to the unseen, unknown, and all-powerful Angkar, the organization. Sihanouk's staggering miscalculation, his belief that he could ride this tiger and then simply dismount, was a subject he spoke about openly with journalists and diplomats who visited him in his comfortable exile. His arrogance was breathtaking. He was so convinced of his own indispensability that he couldn't fathom a Cambodia without him at its center. This fatal hubris is perfectly captured in our uncomfortable quote, a sentiment Sihanouk expressed repeatedly during this period. Some people worry about the Khmer Rouges, but they are not true communists. They are nationalists, and I am the embodiment of Khmer nationalism. They depend on me. Without Sihanouk, they are nothing. After our victory, I shall have them for breakfast. I will spit them out like a cherry stone. They are a temporary inconvenience, a tool to regain my throne. Spit them out like a cherry stone. He believed it. He thought he was the puppet master. But every radio broadcast he made, every peasant who took up arms in his name, was simply another strand in the web the Khmer Rouge were weaving. The Angkar was using his voice, his legitimacy, his divine aura, as a cloak of invisibility for their own monstrous project. They operated under his banner, all the while preparing for the day when that banner would be torn down and burned. The alliance wasn't a partnership. It was a parasitic infection. Sihanouk was the host, providing the legitimacy and popular support that the virus needed to replicate until it was strong enough to consume the host entirely. And this leads to the most tragic consequence of Sihanouk's ego-driven pact. He did not just enable his own future executioners. He actively served as their chief recruiting officer. His name, and his name alone, gave the Khmer Rouge the popular support they needed to grow from a marginal insurgency into a massive nationwide army. He personally legitimized the very movement that was meticulously planning the annihilation of his family, his followers, and the entire social order he claimed to cherish. Every broadcast from Beijing was a nail in Cambodia's coffin, hammered in by the very man who saw himself as its savior. Sihanouk's desperate, narcissistic quest to reclaim a throne he would never truly hold was perhaps the greatest betrayal of all. He delivered his people, bound and gagged by their loyalty to him, directly into the hands of the architects of Year Zero. An army of ideologically possessed recruits, rallied to a cause by the voice of an exiled prince, is still just a mob. To become a revolutionary force, it needs one more thing: weapons. The transformation of the Khmer Rouge from a ragtag insurgency into a disciplined, effective fighting force that could challenge Lon Nol's American-supplied army required a massive logistical undertaking. It required a patron willing and able to provide a steady torrent of rifles, mortars, ammunition, and explosives. While Sihanouk was the movement's voice and Pol Pot was its brain, the steel that would be placed in the hands of their soldiers was forged and shipped from the People's Republic of China. But Beijing had a significant logistical problem. They had no direct border with the main battlefields in Cambodia. They couldn't simply drive trucks of weapons across a friendly frontier. Between them and their chosen proxies lay the entire nation of North Vietnam. The solution to this problem is a case study in profound geopolitical irony. To arm their anti-Vietnamese proxies, China had to use Vietnam as the delivery service. They leveraged their position as the primary benefactor to the North Vietnamese war effort, pressuring Hanoi to facilitate the transfer of Chinese arms to their supposed allies in the Cambodian Grunk coalition. The Vietnamese, desperate to maintain the flow of Chinese aid for their own war against the South, had little choice but to comply, even as they knew they were feeding a crocodile that would one day try to eat them. And so, the famous Ho Chi Minh Trail, that legendary network of jungle paths and secret roads, became a two-way street. For years it had been a one-way artery, pumping Vietnamese men and Soviet-supplied war materiel south. Now it developed a new, westward branch. Chinese cargo ships would unload tons of military hardware at the North Vietnamese port of Haiphong. This material, brand new Type 56 assault rifles, the Chinese version of the AK-47, 82mm mortars, RPG-2 rocket launchers, explosives and radio equipment, would be loaded onto trucks and sent south. But at key junctures, a portion of this river of steel would be diverted. It would be handed over to Khmer Rouge logistics teams and funneled west, across the border and into the heart of Cambodia, directly into the hands of Pol Pot's legions. The very trail that Sihanouk had permitted the Vietnamese to build on his soil years ago. The original sin of his failed neutrality was now being used to deliver the weapons that would ultimately destroy his world. This direct high-volume supply line was no secret to Western intelligence agencies, who were tracking the flow of arms with increasing alarm. They could analyze captured weapons, noting the difference between the varied, older Soviet bloc equipment used by the Vietnamese and the homogeneous, factory-fresh Chinese gear being carried by Khmer Rouge fighters. The data painted a very clear and very troubling picture. This is our classified memo for today, a synthesis of the intelligence reports from the period. From Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, to J2, Military Assistance Command, Vietnam. MACV. Subject: Foreign Materiel Analysis, Cambodian Insurgent Forces, CPNLAF. Finding: Analysis of captured materiel from CPNLAF units in the last quarter reveals a significant and sustained increase in factory-new Chinese-origin small arms, mortars, and munitions. This equipment is distinct in origin and condition from the typical Soviet PRC mix found in NVA-VC caches. The uniformity suggests a dedicated high-priority supply chain originating in the PRC and not merely incidental overflow from NVA stocks. Assessment: Beijing's material support for the Khmer Rouge faction is far more direct and extensive than previously estimated. They are not just supplementing the insurgency. They are actively building and equipping it as a distinct fighting force, independent of Hanoi's control. We are witnessing the creation of a fully fledged Chinese proxy army on the western flank of Vietnam. The creation of a fully fledged Chinese proxy army. That is the absolute key. This direct pipeline of arms had a profound and devastating consequence. It bought the Khmer Rouge their independence from Hanoi. Before this, any Cambodian communist movement was utterly reliant on Vietnamese goodwill for every rifle and every bullet. This kept them on a leash. The Chinese supply line severed that leash forever. Pol Pot now had his own independent source of military power. He didn't need to listen to the advice of his Vietnamese comrades anymore. He didn't need to moderate his tactics or subordinate his revolution to their timeline. The flow of Chinese arms armed his paranoia. It gave him the physical means to purge his movement of pro-Vietnamese elements, to escalate the war against Lon Nol on his own terms, and to pursue the insane radical social experiments in the liberated zones that were the precursor to Year Zero. China's support was never just about helping a fellow communist party. It was a calculated investment to create a loyal client state. By providing the weapons, they ensured the Khmer Rouge would be beholden to them and them alone. They were not just arming a revolution, they were arming their revolution. Each rifle sent down that trail was another guarantee that when the war was over, the government in Phnom Penh would answer to Beijing, not to Hanoi or Moscow. They were handing Pol Pot the tools of annihilation, ensuring that the monster they had so carefully cultivated would be well-fed, well-armed, and ready to serve its master's interests. The guns and bullets that flowed down the Ho Chi Minh Trail were the hardware of the revolution, the essential tools for waging war. But China's most significant contribution to the Khmer Rouge was not the hardware, it was the software. It was the ideological blueprint, the political operating system that would govern their brutal logic and guide their hand as they remade Cambodia in their own terrifying image. Khmer Rouge leaders didn't just receive crates of weapons from China. They made regular, secret pilgrimages to Beijing throughout the Civil War to receive intense ideological training that supercharged their already paranoid and radical worldview. Pol Pot's original Parisian Marxism was the seed, but it was in the furnace of Mao's Cultural Revolution that it was forged into a weapon of mass destruction. When men like Pol Pot, Ieng Sari, and Sun Sen visited China in the late 1960s and early 1970s, they were not entering a stable, pragmatic communist state. They were walking into a nation in the grips of a convulsive, decade-long political fever. The Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution was a period of state-sanctioned anarchy and extreme ideological purism, where Mao unleashed the youth of the nation to destroy the four olds: old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. Intellectuals were humiliated and sent to the countryside for re-education. Ancient temples and artworks were smashed. Party officials who showed the slightest hint of moderation were brutally purged. It was a society deliberately, violently tearing itself apart in the name of ideological purity. To the Khmer Rouge leadership, it was not a vision of chaos, it was a vision of paradise. In Beijing, they were not treated as junior partners, as they had been in Hanoi. They were embraced as true disciples, as fellow travelers on the path to a pure, uncorrupted form of communism. They sat in study sessions with high-ranking ideologues of the Chinese Communist Party, including radical figures from the Gang of Four. They absorbed not just the theory of Mao Zedong thought, but the practical, brutal methodology of the Cultural Revolution. They saw in practice how to dismantle a society from the top down. They learned the utility of a powerful, unseen security apparatus for identifying and eliminating internal enemies. They saw how a nation's youth could be turned into a fanatical vanguard, loyal only to the party leader. They witnessed the demonization of urban bourgeois life and the romantic, almost mystical elevation of the peasantry as the sole source of revolutionary virtue. It was, for them, a complete and total validation. The most extreme, violent, and half-formed ideas they had concocted in Paris were now being enacted on a scale of hundreds of millions of people, and their powerful patrons were telling them it was the correct path. It gave them a playbook. Our uncomfortable quote comes from this nexus of ideological transfer, a reconstructed comment from a high-ranking CCP radical, perhaps Mao's infamous security chief Kang Sheng speaking to his colleagues after a session with the Cambodian delegation. These Cambodian comrades are remarkable. They are not like the Vietnamese, who are half Soviet and always talking about industrial production and material incentives. The Cambodians have a deeper understanding. They see the poison of the cities, of the intellectuals, of family ties. They are not afraid of the concept of a clean slate. I believe they have the will to wipe the board completely clean of all bourgeois dust. They may succeed in creating a revolution even purer than our own. A revolution even purer than our own. This was the green light. The Khmer Rouge returned to their jungle bases not just with weapons and supplies, but with a renewed sense of purpose and a clear operational model. The Chinese experience didn't give them their ideas, but it supercharged them. It removed any lingering restraint or doubt. If China could send its doctors and professors to labor in the fields, then the Khmer Rouge could do it to the entire population. If China could destroy its ancient temples in the name of progress, then the Khmer Rouge could eradicate Buddhism. If Mao could be the great helmsman, a godlike figure above the party, then Pol Pot could become brother number one, an unseen, omnipotent leader. And this is the most terrifying consequence of that ideological forging. It ensured that the Cambodian Revolution would be an import of the worst, most violent excesses of Maoism, concentrated and unleashed on a small nation with no capacity to absorb the shock. The policies of Year Zero, the immediate evacuation of the cities, the abolition of money and markets, the separation of families, the mass murder of the educated classes, were not born of some unique Cambodian madness. They were a direct, fanatical application of the lessons the Khmer Rouge leadership learned in China. They were a deliberate attempt to replicate the spirit and methods of the Cultural Revolution, but at a speed and with a totality that even Mao had never attempted. China didn't just arm Pol Pot's legions, it armed his mind. It gave him the intellectual justification and the practical framework for genocide, cloaking it in the language of revolutionary purity. The killing fields were, in a very real sense, a Chinese ideological export. While the Khmer Rouge leadership was absorbing the lessons of the Cultural Revolution in Beijing, their soldiers on the ground in Cambodia were putting those lessons into practice. Between 1970 and 1975, as the Civil War raged, Pol Pot's forces steadily captured more and more territory from the failing corrupt Lon Nol regime. These areas, which they called the liberated zones, became the laboratories for Year Zero. They were dress rehearsals for the genocide to come, small-scale experiments in the total restructuring of human society. And the West had a front-row seat. The popular narrative that the world was shocked and horrified by the Khmer Rouge's brutality when they marched into Phnom Penh in April 1975 is a comforting falsehood. The truth is far uglier. Diplomatic cables, intelligence briefs, and journalist reports from the time prove, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that Western governments knew exactly what the Khmer Rouge were doing for years, and they chose deliberate, calculated silence. The evidence was overwhelming, and it came from a single undeniable source: the hundreds of thousands of refugees who fled the liberated zones. These were not rumors or propaganda from the Lon Nol government. These were first-hand eyewitness accounts, delivered by traumatized men, women, and children who had escaped the Khmer Rouge's expanding dystopia and made their way to the relative safety of the cities. Their stories, told to journalists and diplomats in the refugee camps around Phnom Penh, were terrifyingly consistent. They spoke of the immediate execution of anyone associated with the old government: soldiers, teachers, civil servants. They described the forced collectivization of all property, the abolition of money, the closure of markets. They recounted how Buddhist monks were defrocked and temples were desecrated. They told of families being separated, with children taken away for indoctrination. This was not the random chaos of war. It was a systematic, methodical application of a radical ideology. The American embassy in Phnom Penh was a clearinghouse for this information. Its political officers and CIA agents spent years debriefing refugees, cross-referencing their stories and building a detailed, chilling portrait of the Khmer Rouge's methods and objectives. This information was not buried. It was written up in clinical, bureaucratic language and cabled back to the State Department and the Pentagon. They knew. They knew about the black pajamas, the red checkered scarves, and the absolute, unquestioning obedience to the mysterious Angkar. They knew that the liberation offered by the Khmer Rouge was, in fact, a form of enslavement and death. Yet there was no public outcry, no resolutions at the United Nations, no international condemnation. The reports were classified, filed, and ignored. Why? Because the unfolding Cambodian horror was politically inconvenient. It complicated the single most important foreign policy objective for the Nixon administration: ending the Vietnam War and getting American troops home. This cynical calculation is the dirty secret of the era, the kind of policy decision that is never admitted publicly. It's laid bare in the dry, amoral language of classified communications. Our classified memo for today is a reconstruction of one such cable sent from the U.S. Embassy in Phnom Penh to the Secretary of State in Washington. Secret sensitive from U.S. Embassy, Phnom Penh to Sec State, Wash D.C. Subject: consistent patterns of Khmer Rouge, grunk, brutality in liberated zones. Summary: extensive debriefings of refugees from KR-controlled territory confirm a consistent and centrally directed policy of extreme brutality. This includes but is not limited to: 1. Summary execution of all former Khmer Republic military and civilian officials. 2. Forced relocation of entire village populations into cooperative farms. 3. Suppression of all religious practices, particularly Buddhism. 4. Abolition of private property and currency. These are not isolated acts by rogue commanders, but appear to be the deliberate implementation of a rigid, pre-planned social model. Recommendation: it is recommended that this information not be publicized at this time. Highlighting Grunk atrocities could be perceived as an attempt to justify continued support for the Lon Nol government and could complicate the delicate final stages of negotiations with Hanoi and their PRG allies. Could complicate negotiations. There it is. The cold hard truth. A genocide in the making was weighed against a peace treaty, and the treaty was deemed more important. The lives of millions of Cambodians were a secondary concern, an unfortunate variable that had to be managed so it wouldn't upset the primary strategic goal. The US and its allies were not ignorant. They were willfully blind. They chose not to see, not to speak, because speaking would have required them to act, and acting would have been messy. It would have meant acknowledging that the force they were about to allow to take over Cambodia was not just another group of authoritarian communists, but something far more monstrous. The long-term consequence of this deliberate silence was catastrophic. It created a vacuum of accountability. The Khmer Rouge were allowed to perfect their killing machine in the provinces for 5 years without a single word of international condemnation. This silence was a form of passive complicity. It sent a clear message to Pol Pot and his cadres. The world does not care. Your methods, no matter how brutal, are of no concern to the great powers. This tacit permission slip emboldened them, assuring them that when they finally took the entire country, they could apply their laboratory-tested model of social purification on a national scale without fear of reprisal. When the fall of Phnom Penh came, the West performed its collective gasp of shock. But it was theater. They hadn't been watching a different movie. They had simply walked out during the terrifying previews because they didn't want it to spoil their ending next door. That politically convenient silence, that willful blindness documented in the classified cables from Phnom Penh, was not just a passive act of omission. It was an active policy, ruthlessly executed at the highest levels of the American government by its chief foreign policy architect, national security advisor, and later Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. Kissinger, the Grand Master of Cold War realpolitik, viewed the world as a global chessboard. Nations were not peoples or cultures. They were assets, liabilities, pawns, and knights in a complex game against the Soviet Union. And in the early 1970s, the only goal of his game was to extricate the United States from the quagmire of Vietnam with a veneer of peace with honor. The fate of Cambodia and its people was, in this cold calculus, utterly insignificant, a pawn to be sacrificed to save the king. The culmination of this strategy was the Paris Peace Accords, signed in January 1973. Publicly, it was hailed as a monumental achievement, a diplomatic triumph that ended America's longest war. It secured the return of American prisoners of war and set a timeline for the withdrawal of all U.S. troops. For this, Henry Kissinger and his North Vietnamese counterpart, Le Duc Tho, were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. It remains one of the most controversial and, frankly, obscene awards in the history of the prize, because the peace it celebrated was a cynical fiction, a carefully negotiated holding action designed to give the U.S. a decent interval between its departure and the inevitable collapse of South Vietnam. And for Cambodia, it was not a peace treaty. It was a death sentence signed, sealed, and delivered on the world stage. The accords contained articles that, on paper, were meant to protect Cambodia. They called for an end to all foreign military activities in the country and a respect for its neutrality. But this was a deliberate, diplomatic lie. There was no enforcement mechanism. Kissinger knew, and the negotiating record shows he knew, that the North Vietnamese had no intention of withdrawing the thousands of troops they had stationed on Cambodian soil. More importantly, the treaty did absolutely nothing to disarm or constrain the Khmer Rouge. It locked the corrupt, incompetent, and now increasingly isolated Lon Nol regime into a fight to the death with Pol Pot-es legions, while simultaneously pulling the rug out from under them. The accords mandated a halt to all U.S. military action in Indochina, including the bombing campaigns in Cambodia that were, by 1973, the only thing preventing the Khmer Rouge from overrunning the entire country. Kissinger's calculus was brutal and simple. He needed a deal with North Vietnam. North Vietnam's price for that deal was a free hand for their allies, the Khmer Rouge, to finish their conquest of Cambodia. Kissinger paid that price without hesitation. The survival of the Khmer Republic was a peripheral concern, an irritating detail that could not be allowed to derail the primary objective of American withdrawal. This unsentimental chessboard view of the world is the very definition of Kissinger's approach to diplomacy. Our uncomfortable quote for today reflects that chilling mindset, a reconstructed expression of the cold logic that sealed Cambodia's fate. Our fundamental objective is the honorable extrication of the United States from the conflict in Vietnam. The internal political arrangements of the Khmer people are a peripheral, tertiary matter. We cannot allow the fate of a secondary player to dictate the terms of our primary strategic withdrawal. We have provided them with the means to defend themselves. Their ultimate survival is now in their own hands. Our responsibility ends at our border of strategic interest. Their ultimate survival is now in their own hands. This was the official act of abandonment. The United States had helped create the Lon Nol regime in the 1970 coup, and now, 3 years later, it was walking away, leaving it to be devoured. The Paris Peace Accords were a green light for the Khmer Rouge. The message was unambiguous. The Americans are leaving. Their bombers are grounded. The puppet government in Phnom Penh is alone. The country is yours for the taking. The peace deal for Vietnam was, in reality, a declaration of total, unrestrained war on Cambodia. And this is the sickening long-term consequence of Kissinger's cold calculus. The Nobel Peace Prize was awarded for a diplomatic maneuver that knowingly and deliberately condemned a nation of 7 million people to a future of unimaginable horror, a horror that Kissinger and his staff had been reading about in their own intelligence reports for years. They knew who the Khmer Rouge were. They knew what they did in the liberated zones, and they signed a piece of paper that handed them the rest of the country. The prize wasn't a recognition of peace. It was a reward for a successful retreat, purchased with the future lives of millions. That Nobel medal wasn't made of gold. It was forged from the complicity of silence and the immoral logic of empire, and it was polished with the blood of a people who were sacrificed on the altar of peace with honor. The Nobel Prize had been awarded, the press conferences held, the American troops were going home. But in Cambodia, the war didn't end. It entered its most savage and decisive phase. The Paris Peace Accords of January 1973 were the starting pistol for a 2-year death race. For the Khmer Rouge, the objective was the total conquest of the nation, a goal now tantalizingly within reach. For the Lon Nol government, the Khmer Republic, it was a desperate, doomed struggle for survival. The American air support that had been the Republic's iron lung was officially switched off in August 1973, as a war-weary U.S. Congress legislated an end to all combat operations in Indochina. From that moment on, the government in Phnom Penh was a dead man walking. What followed was a slow, agonizing siege. The Khmer Rouge, now the undisputed masters of the countryside, began the methodical strangulation of the capital. Phnom Penh became an island, a swollen, festering city whose population had tripled to nearly 2 million as terrified refugees poured in from the provinces, fleeing the advancing black pajamaed soldiers and their brutal social experiments. The Khmer Rouge cut off the roads one by one. The only lifeline left was the Mekong River, a fragile artery up which barges, braving constant rocket and sniper fire, could bring food, fuel, and ammunition. The American support that Kissinger had promised would continue was a shadow of its former self, whittled down by a hostile Congress and an administration consumed by the Watergate scandal. The ironclad guarantees given to their Cambodian ally had rusted into worthless scraps of paper. By early 1975, the end was near. The Khmer Rouge had finally succeeded in mining and blockading the Mekong. The last supply convoys were turned back. The American airlift of supplies into the city's airport was a heroic but futile gesture, a band-aid on a mortal wound. Inside Phnom Penh, starvation loomed. The ammunition was running out. The child soldiers of the Khmer Republic were firing their last rounds. The city was surrounded, choked, and ready to fall. In Washington, the debate was not about how to save their ally, but about how to get their own people out. The final act was not a rescue mission. It was an extraction. It was a calculated abandonment, planned with cold, logistical precision. The operation was codenamed Eagle Pull. On April 12, 1975, just 5 days before the city fell, U.S. Marines landed in helicopters at a compound near the American embassy. The evacuation was swift, efficient, and brutally selective. American diplomats, military staff, and journalists were taken out. A handful of the highest-ranking Cambodian officials, including the acting president, were flown out with them. But the vast majority of the Cambodians who had worked for the Americans, who had trusted their promises, were left behind. The local embassy staff, the intelligence assets, the military liaisons, the thousands who had staked their lives on their alliance with the United States. They were all abandoned to the mercy of the approaching Khmer Rouge. A final desperate cable from the U.S. Ambassador John Gunther Dean pleaded for a broader evacuation, a recognition of moral responsibility. The response from Washington was ice cold. Our classified memo is the substance of that final tragic exchange. Top secret, eyes only from Ambassador Dean, Phnom Penh, to Secretary Kissinger, Wash, D.C., via emergency channel message. The city will fall within a matter of days. Organized resistance is collapsing. Request immediate expanded evacuation authority for all local embassy staff and their dependents, as well as key government and military contacts who face certain execution. We have a profound moral obligation to these people who have served us loyally. To leave them is to condemn them. Reply: authority is denied. Operation Eagle Pull is restricted to U.S. citizens and designated third country nationals. You are not authorized to expand the evacuee list. We cannot accept responsibility for the entire Cambodian nation. Execute the operation as planned. Do not deviate. We cannot accept responsibility. With that, the books were closed. Ambassador Dean was one of the last to leave, famously carrying a folded American flag under his arm. It was a potent symbol. The flag was safe, but the nation it had been planted in was being left to burn. The final U.S. withdrawal was not a panicked retreat in the face of an enemy assault. It was the calm, orderly execution of a policy of abandonment that had been decided years earlier in Paris. It was the last logical step in a strategy that had always treated Cambodia as an expendable piece in a larger game. The ultimate devastating consequence of this final act was the stark and brutal lesson it taught the world about the nature of superpower patronage. The United States had midwifed the birth of the Khmer Republic, funded it, directed its war, and then, when the strategic calculus shifted, coolly presided over its funeral. The abandonment of Phnom Penh wasn't a mistake or a failure of intelligence. It was the policy itself, working as intended. It was a demonstration that for a global power, an alliance is a contract of convenience, and when that convenience ends, so does the contract. The gates of Phnom Penh were left wide open, not by accident but by design, ensuring that the slaughter that followed would be absolute and uninterrupted. The gates of Phnom Penh, abandoned by their American-backed guardians, did not stay open for long. On April 17, 1975, the soldiers of the Khmer Rouge entered the city. At first, there was a tentative sense of relief among the millions crammed inside. The war was over. The shelling had stopped. But that relief lasted only for a few hours. The soldiers who entered the city were not liberators. They were silent, disciplined, black-clad teenagers from the countryside, their faces blank and unreadable, and they came with an order so insane, so absolute, that it defied all comprehension. Using loudspeakers and firing their rifles into the air, they instructed the entire population of the city, all 2 million people, to leave. Immediately. They were told it was for their own safety, a temporary measure to avoid an imminent American bombing raid that never came. They were told to leave their homes unlocked, to take only what they could carry for a 3-day journey. It was all a lie. This was not a temporary evacuation. This was day 1 of year 0. This was not a panicked, improvised decision made in the chaos of victory. It was the deliberate, pre-planned execution of a core ideological principle, a radical plan whose blueprint was not Cambodian, but a twisted, fanatical application of Maoist theory. The Khmer Rouge leadership, in their ideological training sessions in Beijing, had been profoundly influenced by the excesses of the Chinese Cultural Revolution. They had absorbed the core Maoist tenet that cities were evil, parasitic, corrupt, bourgeois institutions that exploited the pure, virtuous peasantry. Cities were the source of foreign influence, intellectualism, and resistance. Therefore, to build a truly pure agrarian communist utopia, the city as a concept had to be physically and spiritually annihilated. The Chinese had experimented with this. They had forcibly relocated millions of bourgeois urban youth and intellectuals to the countryside for re-education through hard manual labor. The Khmer Rouge looked at this policy and saw not a social catastrophe, but a model of timid incrementalism. Why relocate millions when you could relocate everyone? Why re-educate the bourgeois class when you could liquidate it in a single stroke by destroying its habitat? This was their great leap forward, an attempt to out-Mao Mao himself. The plan to empty Phnom Penh and all other Cambodian cities was discussed with and approved by their patrons in Beijing. Chinese political hardliners, themselves the architects of the Cultural Revolution, saw the Khmer Rouge's plan as a daring and admirable experiment in revolutionary purity. They encouraged it. They saw it as Cambodia's chance to leapfrog directly to ideal communism, avoiding the messy, prolonged stages that had troubled other revolutions. The cold, detached, ideological fervor behind this act is almost impossible for a rational mind to grasp. It viewed millions of human beings not as people, but as abstract class categories to be forcibly rearranged. Our uncomfortable quote today is from the perspective of a foreign observer, a Chinese political advisor filing a report back to Beijing in the days following the fall of Phnom Penh. The Kampuchean comrades are implementing the urban clearing policy with admirable revolutionary firmness. The process is chaotic, as is to be expected, but it is a necessary and cleansing chaos. They are succeeding where we only experimented in stages. They are liquidating the very concept of the urban parasite class in a single, decisive action. This is a painful but essential surgery on the corrupt body politic. The foundation for a truly new society is being laid. A painful but essential surgery. That is the language of the ideologue, the voice of a man who sees a city full of screaming, terrified, dying people, and thinks only of the purity of the final outcome. This foreign blueprint, this imported and weaponized Maoist theory, had a uniquely devastating consequence. By emptying the cities in a matter of days, the Khmer Rouge achieved the instantaneous destruction of Cambodian society. With one order, they shattered every existing social bond. Families were separated in the chaos of the exodus. Hospitals were emptied, leaving the sick and dying on the roadsides. Schools, universities, monasteries, markets, every institution of civil society ceased to exist. They atomized the entire population, turning millions of individual citizens into a single, undifferentiated mass of exhausted, terrified refugees, completely dependent on the Angkar for their next grain of rice. This was not just a forced march. It was the largest, most successful hostage-taking in modern history. The Khmer Rouge had captured the entire urban population of a country and turned them into prisoners in a nationwide gulag. This single act made everything that followed possible. It was the necessary first step that enabled the classification of the population into old people, the peasants, and the suspect, bourgeois new people from the cities. It created the vast, disorganized labor camps that would become the killing fields. The foreign blueprint for Year Zero wasn't just a plan for a revolution. It was a meticulously designed machine for total social annihilation, and the emptying of the cities was the turning of the key that started its engine. The emptying of Phnom Penh was not an act committed in darkness. It was a crime against humanity perpetrated in broad daylight, and the world had witnesses. The last handful of foreign journalists and diplomats who had stayed behind for the city's fall saw the beginning of the exodus with their own eyes. Men like Sidney Schanberg of the New York Times and John Swain of the Sunday Times watched in horror as the silent, disciplined teenagers in black pajamas forced an entire civilization onto the roads at gunpoint. They saw patients being pushed out of hospitals on their beds, relatives carrying the dying on their backs. Their dispatches, once they were able to get them out, were not rumors. They were eyewitness accounts of an atrocity in progress. Chilling images, some of the last to escape the country for years, confirmed their reports. The world saw the river of humanity flowing out of the city into a green, unknown hell. The evidence was immediate, graphic, and undeniable. And the world's response was a pathetic, resounding silence, punctuated by the meaningless procedural jargon of a paralyzed international system. At the United Nations in New York, the institution supposedly created to prevent such horrors from ever happening again, the issue was raised. But the UN is not a moral authority. It is a political arena, and the raw power politics of the Cold War ensured that Cambodia's agony would be ignored. The Khmer Rouge's new state, which they called Democratic Kampuchea, had a powerful, unshakable protector on the UN Security Council, the People's Republic of China. As Pol Pot's primary patron, Beijing used its diplomatic muscle and its veto power as a shield to deflect any and all criticism. Any attempt to introduce a resolution condemning the forced evacuation was immediately blocked. Chinese diplomats with straight faces described the emptying of the cities as a bold and necessary post-war resettlement program, a measure to ensure food security, and above all, a purely internal affair of a sovereign nation. The rest of the world powers were complicit in their inaction. The Soviet bloc, though rivals of China, was certainly not going to vote to condemn a fellow communist revolution that had just handed a humiliating defeat to the United States. And in the West, there was a profound and debilitating Indochina fatigue. Having just traumatically extricated themselves from Vietnam, the American public and government had zero appetite for another entanglement in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Washington had washed its hands of the region. Furthermore, a significant and vocal segment of the political left in Europe and America was initially willing to give the Khmer Rouge the benefit of the doubt, dismissing the early atrocity reports as sour grapes from the losing side or outright CIA propaganda. They had been lied to about the Vietnam War for so long, they were primed to disbelieve anything that painted a new communist government in a bad light. The result was a perfect storm of geopolitical paralysis. The utter cynicism and impotence of the international community is a story best told not in grand speeches, but in the quiet, despairing admissions of those who saw the machinery of diplomacy up close. Our uncomfortable quote for today is a reconstruction from the private diary of a European ambassador at the UN, written in the weeks after the fall of Phnom Penh. Today in the Security Council, we saw the reports. The photographs from Cambodia are unspeakable. A city of 2 million people marched into the jungle at gunpoint. And what was the official response? A 3-hour debate on the wording of a procedural motion that was ultimately tabled. The Chinese delegate spoke of internal sovereignty and post-war urban reform. The American ambassador looked haunted and exhausted. The Soviets said nothing of substance. Nobody wants this fight. We all know precisely what is happening over there, and we have all collectively agreed to pretend that we do not. We have all collectively agreed to pretend that we do not. This was the tacit agreement that governed the world's response. The devastating long-term consequence of this global paralysis was that it provided the Khmer Rouge with an impenetrable shield of impunity. The UN's inaction, the West's fatigue, and China's diplomatic protection gave Pol Pot a clear, unambiguous signal. You can do whatever you want. No one is coming to stop you. The world is not watching. This initial failure to act on the clear evidence of the city evacuations set the pattern for the next 3.5 years. It gave the Ankara a completely free hand to implement its genocidal project in total isolation, behind a wall of silence built by Chinese vetoes and Western indifference. The geopolitical veto war at the UN wasn't just a political stalemate. It was the sound of the great powers locking the doors to Cambodia from the outside, trapping millions inside with their executioners. The world didn't fail to discover the killing fields. It watched the foundations being laid and chose to look away. The paralysis at the United Nations was more than just a diplomatic failure. It was a smokescreen. And behind that screen of international inaction, the Khmer Rouge's primary patron, the People's Republic of China, moved from being a quiet backer to the active, indispensable lifeline of a genocidal state. China's role after April 1975 went far beyond simply blocking resolutions at the UN. They deployed their considerable international power, their economic might, and their military-industrial complex to provide a complete and total life support system for democratic Kampuchea. As the killing fields began to fill with bodies, it was Chinese food that fed the executioners, Chinese trucks that transported them, and Chinese guns that armed them. While the Khmer Rouge were systematically dismantling Cambodia's economy, blowing up the national bank, abolishing currency, and forcing the entire population into primitive agrarian slavery, they were simultaneously the recipients of one of the most generous foreign aid packages in the world, courtesy of Beijing. It was a paradox of staggering proportions. The regime that preached absolute self-reliance was, in fact, utterly dependent on a foreign power for its survival. Thousands of Chinese technical advisors poured into the country. They were not ideologues. They were engineers, port managers, logistics experts, and military technicians. They kept the country's few functioning factories running. They managed the port of Kampong Som, where shiploads of Chinese aid arrived. They provided the telecommunications equipment that allowed the Angkar to command its vast network of terror. They were the technocratic backbone of a state that was murdering all of its own technocrats. The military aid, which had flowed steadily during the war, now became a torrent. This wasn't about fighting a civil war anymore. The war had been won. This was about building the Khmer Rouge army into a formidable regional force, a sharpened stick to poke their mutual enemy, Vietnam. China sent tanks, heavy artillery, naval patrol boats, and even a squadron of J-6 fighter jets. They oversaw the construction of a massive new military airfield at Kampong Chnang, a project with no conceivable purpose for internal security. Its only strategic value was as a potential staging ground for Chinese air power in a future conflict with Vietnam. Beijing was not just supporting a client, it was building a military garrison on its rival's flank. Internationally, China worked tirelessly to legitimize the regime. They stage-managed official state visits, bringing figures like Pol Pot, still a shadowy, unknown entity to the outside world, to Beijing, where he was hailed as a great revolutionary leader by Mao's successor, Chairman Hua Guofeng. They broadcast glowing propaganda about the supposed economic miracles and revolutionary successes of democratic Kampuchea, painting a picture of a thriving socialist utopia for the outside world, a picture they knew through their thousands of advisors on the ground was a grotesque lie. The cold geopolitical logic behind this total support system was never publicly stated, but it was the unwavering foundation of their foreign policy. This logic is captured in our uncomfortable quote, a reconstruction of the guiding principle discussed in the highest echelons of the Chinese Foreign Ministry. The internal social policies of our Kampuchean comrades, while unorthodox, are their sovereign right as a revolutionary state. Our primary, non-negotiable strategic objective is to ensure their military and economic strength. A powerful, independent, and anti-Vietnamese Kampuchea is the most effective bulwark against Soviet-backed expansionism in Southeast Asia. Therefore, we must provide whatever material assistance is necessary to guarantee the stability and strength of their state, irrespective of their chosen methods of governance. Irrespective of their chosen methods of governance. In that clinical, amoral phrase lies China's complicity. They knew what the methods were. Their embassy remained open in the deserted city of Phnom Penh. Their advisors saw the skeletal work crews in the countryside. They heard the stories. But the genocide was an acceptable price to pay for having a loyal, anti-Vietnamese attack dog in their backyard. The devastating long-term consequence of China's diplomatic and material shield is simple. It was the sole factor that allowed the Khmer Rouge regime to survive. Without the constant, massive infusions of Chinese fuel, food, medicine, and military hardware, the regime's insane economic model would have led to its own collapse within a year. It was not self-sufficient. It was a failed state propped up entirely by a superpower patron. China did not just protect the Khmer Rouge from international censure. They actively enabled the genocide by providing the logistical and technical means for it to continue, day after bloody day, for 3.5 years. The killing fields were not just a Cambodian phenomenon. They were a joint venture, and China was the silent, indispensable partner. While China served as the primary architect and financier of the Khmer Rouge's House of Horrors, the regime's direct neighbors, the nations of ASEAN, played the role of the quiet, accommodating neighborhood watch who saw the fires and heard the screams, but made a collective decision not to call for help. The complicit silence of Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and the Philippines was not born of ignorance. It was a calculated policy, a conscious choice to prioritize what they perceived as their own national security and economic stability over the lives of millions of Cambodians. They saw the genocide unfolding on their doorstep and collectively decided it was a price worth paying to keep a larger, more immediate threat at bay. To understand their cold calculus, you have to understand the sheer terror that swept through the non-communist capitals of Southeast Asia in April 1975. The fall of Phnom Penh was immediately followed by the fall of Saigon. The Vietnam War was over, and the communists had won. From the perspective of Bangkok or Singapore, the result was a geopolitical nightmare. A newly unified, battle-hardened Vietnam, with the fourth largest army in the world, backed by the full might of the Soviet Union. The domino theory that America had obsessed over for decades seemed to be coming true. Vietnam was now the regional superpower, an expansionist force that they believed would look to dominate the entire peninsula. In this climate of fear, the bizarre and murderous regime in democratic Kampuchea was viewed through a purely strategic lens. Yes, the stories filtering across the border were horrifying. Yes, their ideology was insane, but the Khmer Rouge had one overriding virtue in the eyes of their ASEAN neighbors. They were rabidly, pathologically anti-Vietnamese. They were sponsored by China, Vietnam's main rival. This made them, in the cold logic of realpolitik, a crucial asset. A feral, independent, and even genocidal Cambodia served as a vital strategic buffer, a jagged piece of broken glass on Vietnam's western flank that would keep Hanoi preoccupied and contained. A Cambodia run by Pol Pot was a regional problem. A Cambodia absorbed into a greater Vietnamese empire was, to them, an existential threat, and so ASEAN as a bloc adopted a strict, formal policy of non-interference in the internal affairs of its members and neighbors. This convenient diplomatic principle became the perfect cover for their strategic inaction. They accepted the credentials of Khmer Rouge diplomats. They engaged in limited formal dialogue, and when the ever-growing mountain of evidence about the mass killings was presented, the official response was a collective shrug. It was an internal matter for the government of democratic Kampuchea to resolve. This was a deliberate, self-serving fiction that allowed them to maintain a posture of diplomatic propriety, while endorsing the very conditions that allowed the genocide to flourish. Our uncomfortable quote for today captures this brutally pragmatic mindset, a reconstructed sentiment from a senior ASEAN foreign minister in a closed-door regional summit. We do not have the luxury of choosing our neighbors, only the reality of living with them. The reports from Phnom Penh are, of course, deeply disturbing. But let us be frank. A hostile and independent Kampuchea is a strategic inconvenience. A Kampuchea that is a satellite of Hanoi is a mortal threat to the sovereignty of every nation in this room. Our primary duty is to the security of our own people. Therefore, we must deal with the world as it is, not as we might wish it to be. The internal governance of Kampuchea is, and must remain, their affair. Their affair. With those two words, a moral line was drawn, placing millions of human beings on the wrong side of it. The devastating long-term consequence of ASEAN's complicit silence was that it completed the total isolation of the Cambodian people. It created a regional consensus of inaction that legitimized the broader international paralysis. If Cambodia's own neighbors weren't going to intervene, why should anyone else? By treating the Khmer Rouge as a normal, if eccentric member of the regional community, they helped to normalize the unthinkable. They sent a clear signal to Pol Pot that as long as his regime served the useful purpose of being a thorn in Vietnam's side, the methods he used to rule his own people were completely irrelevant. This regional realpolitik was another lock on the door of Cambodia's prison, another guarantee to the inmates that no help was coming, especially not from the people right next door. Their fear of the Vietnamese domino was so great that they were willing to ignore the Cambodian abyss. Within the broader ASEAN consensus of complicit silence, one nation stands out for the sheer hands-on cynicism of its policy. For Cambodia's western neighbor Thailand, the Khmer Rouge regime was not just a convenient strategic buffer, it was a business partner. The Thai government, particularly its powerful and often corrupt military establishment, didn't just ignore the crisis next door. It actively profited from it all, while pursuing a refugee policy of such calculated brutality that it amounted to accessory to mass murder. For Thailand, the principle of non-interference was a convenient fiction that masked a far uglier reality of collaboration and deadly pragmatism. The Thai-Cambodian border was not a line of separation, it was a blood-soaked marketplace. On one hand, the border became a crucial economic lifeline that helped sustain the Khmer Rouge regime. While Pol Pot's government had officially abolished money and markets for its own citizens, it happily engaged in international trade to acquire the resources it needed to maintain its grip on power. Thai military leaders and businessmen were their willing partners. A lucrative, semi-official cross-border trade flourished. The Khmer Rouge offered up Cambodia's natural resources, gems from the mines near Pailin, tropical hardwood from the forests, and in return, the Thais provided them with whatever they needed: medicine, fuel, spare parts, and other essentials that their shattered internal economy could not produce. This trade directly enriched a network of corrupt Thai officials and simultaneously provided the Angkar with the logistical means to continue its reign of terror. It was a partnership greased by greed, a business arrangement with a genocidal state. On the other hand, for the desperate Cambodian civilians who saw the Thai border not as a place of commerce, but as their only hope of escape, the policy was one of savage inhumanity. While Thai generals were making deals with Khmer Rouge commanders, their soldiers were systematically rounding up tens of thousands of refugees who had risked everything to flee the killing fields. The official Thai policy was that these were illegal immigrants, not legitimate refugees, and they were to be forcibly repatriated. This was a death sentence, and the Thais knew it. In numerous, well-documented cases, entire camps of refugees were loaded onto trucks, driven to remote parts of the border, and literally pushed back into Cambodia, directly into the hands of waiting Khmer Rouge patrols. The most infamous example occurred at the Preah Vihear Temple in June 1979, where over 40,000 Cambodians were forced down a steep escarpment into a heavily mined area where they were met with machine guns and clubs by Khmer Rouge soldiers. This two-faced policy, business with the killers, brutality for the victims, was justified by the cold, unsentimental logic of national security. The view from a Thai military command post on the border was stripped of all morality. Our uncomfortable quote for today embodies that mindset, a reconstructed statement from a Thai border commander to a visiting journalist. "My responsibility is the security and integrity of the Thai border, not the internal problems of Cambodia. We cannot become a dumping ground for their entire population. We have our own stability to consider. The authority on that side of the line is the government of Democratic Kampuchea. We have a working relationship with them. It is a practical necessity. These refugees are their citizens, their problem. We are simply returning them to their country of origin in accordance with that authority. Returning them to their country of origin. A clean, bureaucratic euphemism for delivering lambs to the slaughter. The devastating long-term consequence of Thailand's border policy was that it represented the most active, direct, and intimate form of complicity in the genocide. This was not the distant high-level veto of the Chinese at the UN or the strategic hand-wringing of other ASEAN nations. This was face-to-face. Thai soldiers looked into the eyes of the people they were sending back to be murdered. Thai merchants counted the money they made selling goods that kept the murder machine running. They turned what should have been a frontier of hope into a final, impassable wall, an extension of the prison that Cambodia had become. The blood-soaked Thai border stands as the ultimate monument to the moral collapse that occurs when greed and strategic fear completely eclipse basic human decency, proving that the worst evils are often committed not by distant monsters, but by neighbors who simply decide it's more profitable to help them. While the Thai border served as a brutal pragmatic interface between the Khmer Rouge and the outside world, the regime's official face to the international community was presented in a far more controlled and surreal environment, the deserted, silent capital of Phnom Penh itself. After the city was emptied, it became the ghost-like headquarters of the Angkar. And within this ghost city, a handful of foreign embassies were allowed to remain open, their flags flying over empty streets in a country with no citizens. These diplomats were not observers. They were prisoners in a gilded cage, serving as willing and in some cases enthusiastic props in a horrifying stage play designed to project an image of normalcy that was a complete and utter fiction. These were not the embassies of Western powers. They were the missions of China, North Korea, Albania, Yugoslavia, Romania, Egypt, and a few other nations from the communist or non-aligned blocs. Their diplomats were confined to a walled compound, the site of the former French embassy, unable to leave without official minders from the Khmer Rouge Foreign Ministry. They could not travel the country. They could not speak to any ordinary Cambodians, for there were none. Their entire world was the compound, their fellow isolated diplomats, and the official party line pronouncements of the men in black pajamas who served as their handlers. They were an embassy of unseeing eyes, stationed in the epicenter of a genocide they were forbidden to witness. Their entire purpose was to participate in a carefully managed theatrical production. On occasion, they would be taken on meticulously staged tours. They would be driven along cleared roads, past empty, decaying buildings, to a designated model cooperative in the countryside. There they would see specially selected healthy-looking peasants dressed in new clothes, enthusiastically working in the fields and singing revolutionary songs. They would be shown bountiful harvests that were pure fiction, staged for the camera and the diplomatic corps. As soon as the diplomats' convoy disappeared over the horizon, the props would be put away, and the model peasants would be returned to their near-starvation rations and brutal work schedules. The diplomats, for their part, would file reports back to their home capitals, dutifully repeating the production figures and propaganda slogans they had been fed. They knew it was a lie. They lived in a silent, dead city of 2 million people. They saw the skeletal figures of the forced laborers who were occasionally marched through to perform maintenance. They could feel the terror in the air. Yet, they played their part. Our uncomfortable quote for today comes from the private journal of one of these men, a disillusioned diplomat from a non-aligned country, trapped in the absurdity of his posting. We see nothing but the walls of this compound, the manicured lawn, and the rehearsed smiles of our official minders. The city is a silent tomb. Yesterday, our tour group was shown a textile factory supposedly exceeding its production quota. The workers looked more like skeletons than people, but they smiled for us. We report back the official statistics from the foreign ministry, knowing they are pure fantasy, invented in a room down the hall. We are not here as diplomats. We are actors. Our government insists we stay to maintain relations. Our role is to applaud the performance, no matter how grotesque we know the reality is behind the curtain. Our role is to applaud the performance. This was the devastating consequence of their presence. These embassies provided the Khmer Rouge regime with its single greatest asset, a veneer of international legitimacy. Their very existence allowed the regime's patrons, like China, to deflect criticism. It was a crucial talking point. How could the stories from refugees be true if all of these countries still maintained normal diplomatic relations? The presence of these flags, flying over a ghost town, created an official counter-narrative. It suggested that democratic Kampuchea was a functioning sovereign state, not a nationwide death camp. These diplomats, by agreeing to their confinement, by participating in the staged tours and parroting the official propaganda, became instruments in the cover-up. They were the unseeing eyes that the regime could point to as proof that there was nothing to see. Each report they filed, Each National Day reception they attended was another coat of paint on the charnel house, another small act of complicity that helped hide the truth of the killing fields from the world. While the diplomats in their Phnom Penh compound were applauding a stage play of revolutionary success, the Khmer Rouge was beginning its bloody third act on the international stage. The regime's paranoia and xenophobia were not just reserved for its own people. They were the driving force of its foreign policy, a policy that had only one true target: Vietnam. From 1975 onwards, but escalating dramatically in 1977 and 1978, the Khmer Rouge began launching a series of increasingly bold and murderous cross-border raids into Vietnamese territory. These were not simple border skirmishes over disputed territory. They were calculated acts of extermination, driven by a centuries-old racial animosity that had been supercharged into a core tenet of the Angkar-S ideology. This was Pol Pot's great strategic overreach, a direct challenge to his former patrons in Hanoi, and the suicidal blunder that would bring his entire regime crashing down. The Khmer Rouge leadership was possessed by a historical grievance. They believed that the Mekong Delta region of southern Vietnam, which they called Kampuchea Krom, was ancient Khmer land stolen by the Vietnamese. Their ultimate revolutionary goal was not just to purify Cambodia, but to reclaim this lost territory. This fantasy was fueled and enabled by the massive influx of military aid from China. With Chinese tanks, artillery, and a steady supply of ammunition, Pol Pot and his commanders began to believe their own propaganda, that their soldiers, hardened by revolution and spiritually pure, were invincible. They believed they could provoke, bleed, and ultimately defeat the powerful battle-tested Vietnamese army. It was a delusion of grandeur on a national scale. The raids began as small incursions but quickly escalated into full-scale massacres. Khmer Rouge military units would cross the border, bypass Vietnamese army outposts, and descend on undefended civilian villages. Their methods were designed for maximum terror, mirroring the brutality they employed against their own people. They sought not to occupy territory, but to annihilate its inhabitants. Entire villages were wiped out, their populations, men, women, children, and infants, slaughtered with axes, machetes, and bayonets in acts of unimaginable savagery. This wasn't war. It was an attempt at a localized cross-border genocide, a purification of the frontier. The official voice of the regime, Radio Phnom Penh, broadcasted a torrent of hysterical racist bile against the Yuan, a deeply derogatory term for the Vietnamese. Our uncomfortable quote for today is a direct reflection of that genocidal rhetoric. The Yuan enemy is treacherous. They have ambitions to swallow our land. We must cleanse our territory and our people of the foul Yuan presence. We must sharpen our revolutionary vigilance. One of our brave Kampuchean soldiers is equal to 30 of theirs. We must build up our strength to liberate the lands of Kampuchea Krom that have been stolen from us. One of ours is worth 30 of theirs. This was the fanatics' arithmetic that convinced them they could win. For a long time, Vietnam, exhausted from decades of war and trying to rebuild its own country, responded with restraint. They issued diplomatic protests. They launched limited counterattacks to push the Khmer Rouge back. But they underestimated the sheer, obsessive hatred that drove Pol Pot's regime. The tipping point, the single act of barbarity so profound that it made a full-scale war inevitable, came in April 1978 in the Vietnamese district of Ba Choc. A large Khmer Rouge force crossed the border and overran a series of villages. For 12 days, they engaged in a systematic slaughter. They herded civilians into temples and pagodas and then blew them up with grenades. They hunted down anyone who tried to hide. In the end, 3,157 civilians were massacred. It was a crime of such magnitude that it could not be ignored. This was the fatal miscalculation that was the direct consequence of Pol Pot's ideology. Blinded by his own racist dogma and made arrogant by Chinese support, he believed he could commit mass murder on his neighbor's territory with impunity. He thought his Chinese patrons would protect him from any serious reprisal. He fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the government in Hanoi. They were not a decadent Western power that would turn a blind eye. They were a hardened, ruthless, and pragmatic Leninist state. The Ba Chuk massacre was not just a raid, it was a direct challenge to the legitimacy and security of the Vietnamese state. The Khmer Rouge had poked the hornet's nest with a sharpened, bloody stick one too many times. The response, when it came, would be overwhelming and decisive. Pol Pot's fanatical, murderous war to reclaim the past would be the very thing that guaranteed his regime had no future. The Ba Chuk massacre was the final invoice for years of Vietnamese restraint, an atrocity so profound it demanded a response. In late 1978, the hardened, pragmatic leaders in Hanoi's Politburo made a decision. The problem of their rabid, Chinese-backed neighbor could no longer be managed through containment. It had to be eliminated, and so on Christmas Day 1978, over 150,000 veteran troops of the People's Army of Vietnam, supported by tanks and air power, rolled across the Cambodian border. This was not a humanitarian mission. Let's be absolutely clear about that. It was a brutal, efficient act of national self-preservation, an invasion launched not to save the Cambodian people, but to crush a threat to the Vietnamese state. The fact that it also ended a genocide was, in the cold calculus of international politics, a purely incidental benefit. The Vietnamese invasion was a blitzkrieg. The Khmer Rouge army, while fanatical and well-equipped by the Chinese, was also poorly led, strategically inept and hollowed out by years of insane internal purges. They were no match for one of the most experienced and disciplined fighting forces on the planet. The Vietnamese divisions shattered the Khmer Rouge defenses and drove deep into the country. On January 7, 1979, just 2 weeks after the invasion began, they captured a deserted, decaying Phnom Penh. The Khmer Rouge leadership, including Pol Pot, had already fled west toward the Thai border, to lick their wounds and begin a new life as a guerrilla insurgency. The Vietnamese soldiers who entered the capital found a ghost city, but they also stumbled upon the evidence of the horror: the torture archives of Tuol Sleng, the mass graves of Choeung Ek. They had, by acting in their own self-interest, inadvertently thrown open the doors to a slaughterhouse. And what was the world's reaction to this act that ended one of the 20th century's worst genocides? Was it praise, relief, a global thank you? No. It was near universal and instantaneous condemnation. This is perhaps the most perverse and revealing chapter of the entire scandal. The international community, which had remained silent for 3.5 years while Pol Pot murdered his own people, suddenly found its voice in a chorus of outrage the moment Vietnam crossed the border. In the halls of the United Nations, a bizarre, unholy alliance of China, the United States, and the ASEAN nations joined forces to denounce Vietnam for its blatant act of aggression. They cared not one whit that a genocide had been stopped. Their sole focus was that the sacred principle of national sovereignty had been violated. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. The same nations that had ignored, enabled, and profited from the Khmer Rouge regime now presented themselves as the great defenders of that regime's right to exist. The motivation was pure, cynical geopolitics. For China, it was the humiliation of seeing their key strategic proxy so easily defeated. For ASEAN and the United States, it was the terrifying spectacle of their great regional fear coming true. A Soviet-backed Vietnam, now seemingly proving its expansionist ambitions by invading a neighbor and installing a new puppet government. The victims of the genocide were forgotten. The only thing that mattered was the border that had been crossed. This is our uncomfortable quote, a sentiment that echoed through the halls of the U.S. State Department and Western embassies at the UN. We cannot, under any circumstances, condone or endorse this invasion, regardless of the odious nature of the Pol Pot regime. The precedent of a powerful state invading a weaker neighbor and unilaterally installing a government of its choosing is a flagrant violation of the UN Charter. It is a direct threat to international order and regional stability. The immediate priority of the international community must be to secure the unconditional withdrawal of all Vietnamese forces and restore the sovereignty of Kampuchea. Restore the sovereignty of Kampuchea. This was the diplomatic code for demanding the return of the Khmer Rouge. And this is the absolutely devastating consequence of the unwanted invasion. It created a moral inversion so profound, it stains the history of the late 20th century. The liberator was branded the aggressor. The perpetrators of genocide were repositioned as the victims of foreign occupation, the legitimate representatives of a nation's sovereignty. The world was officially more outraged that Vietnam had crossed a line on a map than it had ever been that the Khmer Rouge had murdered nearly 2 million people inside that line. This cynical geopolitical reaction didn't just condemn the Vietnamese. It set the stage for the next, and in some ways most shameful chapter of the scandal. A decade-long international campaign led by the US and China to support, rearm, and legitimize the defeated Khmer Rouge as a resistance force. The killing had stopped, but the complicity was about to enter a new and even more despicable phase. The international condemnation of Vietnam was just the beginning. For the Khmer Rouge's powerful patron in Beijing, diplomatic outrage was an insufficient response to the humiliation they had just suffered. Their key strategic proxy, the government they had armed, funded, and shielded for years, had been swept from power in a mere 2 weeks by their regional arch-rival. This was not just a geopolitical setback, it was a profound loss of face. A message had to be sent not just to Hanoi but to Moscow and Washington as well. The message was simple and brutal. China's proxies are not to be touched, and defying Beijing has consequences. That message would be written in blood along the mountainous border between China and Vietnam. In February 1979, just over a month after the fall of Phnom Penh, China launched a massive punitive invasion of northern Vietnam. The paramount leader Deng Xiaoping, who had recently consolidated his power, publicly stated that China needed to teach Vietnam a lesson. The official pretext was Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia and the alleged persecution of ethnic Chinese in Vietnam. But this was diplomatic cover. The real purpose was a raw, violent display of force, a punitive expedition designed to punish Vietnam for its insolence. It was a war to restore China's credibility as the region's dominant power and to demonstrate their unwavering commitment to their defeated Khmer Rouge allies. And critically, this act of aggression received a tacit green light from Washington. Deng Xiaoping had visited the United States just weeks before the invasion, briefing President Jimmy Carter on his intentions. The Carter administration, eager to cement its new strategic anti-Soviet alliance with China, did nothing to discourage the attack. They saw it as a useful way to bleed the Vietnamese and, by extension, their Soviet patrons. Hundreds of thousands of troops from the Chinese People's Liberation Army, PLA, poured across the border, launching assaults along the entire front. What followed was a short, exceptionally brutal war. The PLA, which had not fought a major external conflict in decades and was still recovering from the chaos of the Cultural Revolution, relied on human wave tactics against an entrenched and battle-hardened enemy. The Vietnamese, while their main force divisions were still in Cambodia, had left behind a formidable network of highly experienced militia and border troops who exacted a horrific toll on the Chinese attackers. The fighting was savage, with both sides committing atrocities. The Chinese forces advanced, capturing several provincial capitals, but their progress was slow, and their casualties were staggering. Deng Xiaoping's own justification for the war, expressed privately to his inner circle, reveals the arrogant, imperial mindset behind the invasion. This is our uncomfortable quote: "The child is getting naughty, and it is time for us to spank it." The Vietnamese have been arrogant, thinking their Soviet patrons make them invincible. We must go in, bloody their nose, destroy their border infrastructure, and show them that their actions in Kampuchea will not go unpunished. This is not about territory. It is about teaching a necessary lesson in respect. Teaching a necessary lesson in respect. The Chinese military pushed about 25 miles into Vietnam, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. And then, after 27 days of brutal fighting, they unilaterally declared that the lesson had been taught and withdrew. From a purely military perspective, the war was a disaster for China. They failed to achieve any of their major strategic objectives. They did not force Vietnam to withdraw a single soldier from Cambodia. They suffered tens of thousands of casualties and exposed major weaknesses in their own military command and control. But the war's true, devastating consequence was not measured on the battlefield. It was measured in the geopolitical signal it sent. By launching a full-scale war, China demonstrated to the entire world its absolute ironclad commitment to the Khmer Rouge. They had just sacrificed thousands of their own sons in a punitive attack on the nation that had overthrown their genocidal proxies. This act solidified the battle lines for the next decade. It cemented the new de facto alliance of the United States, China, and the ASEAN nations against the Soviet Vietnam bloc. And most tragically for Cambodia, it guaranteed that the Khmer Rouge, though defeated and driven from power, would not be abandoned. China's punitive war was a public promise that they would continue to fund, arm, and politically support Pol Pot's forces in their new role as a guerrilla insurgency. The war wasn't a lesson for Vietnam. It was a lifeline for the Khmer Rouge, ensuring that the long-suffering Cambodian people who had just been liberated from a genocide were about to be plunged right back into another decade of brutal civil war. China's punitive war against Vietnam was the military front of a new, decade-long struggle. The diplomatic front, however, would be waged not in the mountains of Hajiang, but in the polished halls and back rooms of the United Nations headquarters in New York. Here, one of the most morally grotesque and cynical alliances of the entire Cold War would take shape. Having failed to save their proxy on the battlefield, China, now working hand in glove with the United States, would lead a global diplomatic coalition to achieve something truly perverse. They would ensure that the official recognized government of Cambodia, the one entitled to the nation's seat at the UN, remained the Khmer Rouge. After the Vietnamese invasion, a new government was installed in Phnom Penh, the People's Republic of Kampuchea, composed of Cambodian communists who had fled Pol Pot's purges. For the next decade, the world was faced with a choice. Which was the legitimate government of Cambodia? The new administration in the capital, backed by and dependent on an occupying Vietnamese army? Or the overthrown genocidal regime of Pol Pot, now reduced to a guerrilla force hiding in jungle camps along the Thai border? For the US-China-ASEAN bloc, the choice was clear, and it had nothing to do with the welfare of the Cambodian people. Every year, when the UN General Assembly convened, a vote was held in the Credentials Committee to decide who would occupy Cambodia's seat, and every year, the United States and China would lead a successful campaign of lobbying, arm-twisting, and diplomatic maneuvering to ensure that the credentialed representative was from Democratic Kampuchea, the Khmer Rouge. The justification they offered was a masterpiece of cynical legalism. They argued that to recognize the new government in Phnom Penh would be to legitimize Vietnam's invasion. It would be to reward an act of aggression and violate the sacred UN principle of national sovereignty. They were not, they insisted, endorsing the Khmer Rouge's horrific past. They were simply defending international law from the precedent of foreign-imposed regime change. It was an argument that prioritized a line on a map over the lives of millions. The result was a spectacle of surreal, Kafkaesque absurdity. For more than 10 years, a man named Thiounn Prasith, a Paris-educated member of Pol Pot's inner circle, sat in the UN General Assembly as the official ambassador for Cambodia. He was a representative of a regime that had destroyed its own country, murdered a quarter of its people, and now controlled nothing but a few malarial-infested camps. Yet here he was, in the world's most august diplomatic body, giving speeches about self-determination and the evils of foreign aggression, his salary paid by the UN, his legitimacy endorsed by the majority of the world's nations, led by the United States. Our uncomfortable quote for today comes from the heart of this cold strategic logic, a reconstructed sentiment from a high-level U.S. official like Zbigniew Brzezinski, President Carter's national security advisor. Let me be perfectly clear. We find the policies of the Pol Pot regime to be morally reprehensible, but we are faced with a choice between two evils. One is a genocidal regime that, for all practical purposes, no longer holds power. The other is an active and expansionist aggressor state, Vietnam, which is a direct proxy for the Soviet Union. In this global geopolitical context, we must choose to oppose the greater, more immediate threat, which is to deny legitimacy to the fruits of Soviet-backed aggression. We are not choosing Pol Pot. We are choosing to oppose the Soviet Empire. We are choosing to oppose the Soviet Empire. And that choice had devastating, real-world consequences. The UN's blood-stained seat was not just a symbol, it was a lifeline. This official recognition was the single most important asset the Khmer Rouge had. It gave them a veneer of international legitimacy, which was crucial for their survival as an insurgency. It allowed them to maintain embassies, to engage in propaganda on a global stage, and, most critically, it allowed them to be the official recipient of international aid funneled to the anti-Vietnamese resistance. By seeding the Khmer Rouge, the international community, led by the US, and China, was not making a passive legal judgment. It was taking an active role in prolonging the Cambodian Civil War. It was a declaration that the stability of the new government in Phnom Penh was unacceptable, and that the Khmer Rouge were a legitimate tool to be used to bleed Vietnam. The United Nations, an organization founded on the ashes of the Holocaust with the promise of never again, spent over a decade providing a salary, a platform, and a flag to the perpetrators of a genocide. It was the ultimate betrayal of its own charter, the final unforgivable act in the Great Complicity scandal. The diplomatic recognition at the United Nations was the political pillar of the Khmer Rouge's post-genocide survival strategy. The military pillar was constructed along the Thai-Cambodian border, built with Chinese steel, but secretly reinforced by the governments of the United States and the United Kingdom. For years after the full horrific truth of the killing fields was exposed to the world, after the mountains of skulls had been photographed and the torture centers documented, the leading democracies of the West secretly funneled money, food, and military training to a coalition of resistance forces that was utterly dominated by Pol Pot's butchers. It was an operation cloaked in plausible deniability, a shadow war that stands as one of the most profound acts of hypocrisy in modern history. Directly funding the Khmer Rouge was, of course, politically toxic and morally indefensible. The bad optics, as a modern political strategist would say, were insurmountable. So, a solution was engineered. In 1982, with heavy pressure from China, ASEAN, and the United States, a new anti-Vietnamese government in exile was formed, the Coalition Government of Democratic Kampuchea, or the CGDK. This was a grotesque, three-headed monster, a marriage of the damned brokered for pure geopolitical convenience. It consisted of the Khmer Rouge, who provided the vast majority of the soldiers and the only effective fighting force, a royalist faction led by the ever-pliant Prince Sihanouk, who provided the veneer of international legitimacy, and a Republican faction of anti-communist nationalists led by a former Prime Minister, Sun San, who provided the democratic fig leaf. This coalition was a complete fiction. On the ground, the three groups often fought each other as much as they fought the Vietnamese. But on paper, it was a stroke of genius. It allowed the West to funnel aid to the resistance under the guise of supporting the two non-communist factions. The United States, through the CIA, provided millions of dollars in covert funding. The United Kingdom, under Margaret Thatcher, dispatched its elite special air service, the SAS, to the border camps to provide covert military training in sabotage and guerrilla tactics. Publicly, this aid was strictly for Sihanouk and Sun San's forces, but this was a deliberate, cynical charade. Everyone involved in Washington, London, and Bangkok knew that the non-communist factions were militarily insignificant. They knew that the Khmer Rouge was the dominant partner, the spine of the resistance, and they knew that in a guerrilla coalition, resources are fungible. Food aid given to a Sun San camp could free up Khmer Rouge soldiers from farming duties. Intelligence shared with a Sihanoukist commander would inevitably be used in joint operations. This was not an accidental spillover. It was the intended, unspoken design. The cold, operational reality of this policy was well understood within the intelligence community. It was a necessary evil to achieve the primary goal: bleeding Vietnam. Our classified memo for today is a reconstruction of that candid internal assessment. A report from a CIA field analyst to Langley headquarters. Secret, no foreign subject. Assessment of material support to non-communist resistance, NCR. Analysis. U.S. and Allied support for the Sun San and Sihanoukist factions has succeeded in creating a politically viable alternative to the PRK, the government in Phnom Penh. However, their military effectiveness remains marginal compared to the Khmer Rouge, KR. On the ground, operational cooperation is a necessity for survival. Our resources, while officially earmarked for the NCR, inevitably benefit the KR military apparatus through the sharing of food, intelligence, and medical supplies in the border camps. Conclusion: This is an unavoidable operational cost. The KR remains the only element capable of inflicting significant casualties on the Vietnamese army. Our support for the NCR provides the political cover necessary to sustain the coalition, which in turn sustains the KR as the primary instrument of military pressure. The primary instrument of military pressure. That is what the Khmer Rouge had become to the West. A tool. A blood-soaked, genocidal tool to be used to harass, bog down, and punish the Vietnamese for their alliance with the Soviet Union. The devastating consequence of this policy was that it kept the Khmer Rouge not just alive, but strong. Without the political cover of the coalition, and the material benefits that trickled down from Western aid, the Khmer Rouge would have been an isolated pariah force, funded only by China. Instead, they were laundered. They were rehabilitated. The Western aid program allowed them to rebuild their army, to continue their reign of terror in the refugee camps they controlled, and to wage a brutal civil war that terrorized the Cambodian people for another decade. Western democracies, the self-proclaimed champions of human rights, secretly and knowingly, propped up the men of the killing fields, ensuring that the war, the misery, and the dying would continue, all for a minor victory in the grand immoral chess game of the Cold War. The Cold War-fueled civil war that raged throughout the 1980s finally sputtered to a close with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Vietnam, its primary patron gone, withdrew its troops from Cambodia in 1989. This led to a UN-brokered peace process and elections in the early 1990s. But the peace was bought at a familiar price: compromise with the devil. The Khmer Rouge, still a potent military force thanks to a decade of foreign backing, were brought to the negotiating table as a legitimate political faction. They eventually boycotted the elections and collapsed into infighting, with Pol Pot dying under mysterious circumstances in his jungle hideout in 1998. And with the fighting finally over, the world and the Cambodian people were left with a question: what about justice? What about accountability for the deaths of nearly 2 million people? The answer, when it finally came, was a tribunal decades too late. A heavily compromised piece of political theater designed more to close a chapter than to deliver true justice for the architects of the genocide. The Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia, or the ECCC, was a hybrid tribunal, a joint creation of the United Nations and the new Cambodian government. It didn't even begin its work until 2006, nearly 30 years after the Vietnamese had uncovered the skulls of Choeung Ek. That delay itself is a testament to the years of complicity. Justice was never a priority as long as the Khmer Rouge were a useful geopolitical tool. But the fatal compromise was baked into the tribunal's very structure. The new Cambodian government, led by Prime Minister Hun Sen, himself a former Khmer Rouge mid-level commander who had defected to Vietnam, made it abundantly clear from the outset that the court's mandate would be severely limited. Prosecutions would be restricted only to the most senior leaders and those most responsible for the crimes. This was not a legal standard. It was a political red line. It was a deal, struck to ensure that the investigations would never ever touch the thousands of former Khmer Rouge cadres who had since switched sides and were now integrated into the new government's army and bureaucracy. The court was designed not to uncover the full, ugly truth, but to neatly excise a handful of already condemned historical villains. It was a process plagued by constant political interference from the Cambodian government, which actively fought to shut down any investigation that threatened to expand beyond the original, tiny circle of top leaders. The entire process was less a pursuit of justice and more a carefully stage-managed exorcism. The results speak for themselves. After spending over 15 years and more than $300 million, the tribunal convicted exactly 3 people for the crimes of the genocide. Kaing Guek Eav, the commandant of the Tuol Sleng torture center known as Duch, and the 2 most senior surviving leaders Nuon Chea and Keo Samphan. Other key architects like Yang Sari died of old age during the proceedings. The process was so slow, so expensive, and so politically constrained that it felt like a deliberate parody of justice. It was a spectacle for the international community, a way to assuage the guilty conscience of the world, but it was not a true accounting. Our uncomfortable quote comes from the weary, disillusioned perspective of an international lawyer involved in the process. We operate under the convenient fiction that this is a purely judicial process. It is not. It is a political negotiation that ends with a verdict. The government in Phnom Penh has drawn a very clear line, and our hybrid structure means we are not permitted to cross it. So we will convict the men who are already monsters in the history books. We will not be allowed to follow the full chain of command down to the men who actually swung the hose. And we certainly will not be investigating the foreign powers who supplied the guns and the money. This is not about comprehensive justice. This is about providing a legally sound form of historical closure. Historical closure. That was the goal. And that is the tribunal's devastating long-term legacy. By accepting these political limitations, the international community became complicit in one final act of cover-up. The tribunal cemented a narrative of convenience that the Cambodian genocide was the work of a handful of evil, maniacal leaders. It allowed the thousands of lower-level perpetrators to melt back into society without ever facing accountability. And most critically, it ensured that the role of the international enablers, China, the United States, the UK, ASEAN, Thailand, was never formally entered into a court record. The trials were designed to create individual villains, thereby absolving the systems and the states that made their villainy possible. It was a carefully sanitized process that ensured the most uncomfortable truths, the ones that implicated the powerful, would never be told under oath. It was the final betrayal, a neatly packaged legal conclusion to a scandal whose true culprits were and remain far too powerful to ever be brought to justice. The compromise tribunal, with its handful of convictions and its carefully constructed blind spots, was the final punctuation mark on a story whose central theme was always impunity. The failure to deliver comprehensive justice was not an anomaly. It was the perfectly logical conclusion to a 30-year saga, where powerful states and cynical leaders consistently acted in their own self-interest, knowing they would never be held to account. The lingering shadow that hangs over Cambodia is not just the memory of the genocide itself, but the chilling, unassailable fact that it was allowed to happen, enabled at every stage by a global power game where the victims never ever mattered. When you pull back and look at the full, unredacted history, the Cambodian genocide ceases to look like an isolated act of madness by a few crazed ideologues. It looks like the predictable, even inevitable outcome of a sequence of rational, self-interested decisions made in capitals from Washington to Beijing, from Hanoi to Bangkok. It began with a prince who gambled his nation's sovereignty for the illusion of power. It was nurtured by Parisian intellectuals who loved an abstract theory more than actual people. It was given its army by an American bombing campaign that saw Cambodian peasants as collateral damage in another country's war. It was pushed into a full-scale civil war by a US-backed coup that prioritized anti-communism over stability. Then, as the killing began, it was sustained by a global network of complicity. China didn't just back a revolution, it carefully selected, armed, and trained the most extreme anti-Vietnamese faction to serve as its proxy, providing a diplomatic and economic lifeline that kept the genocidal state alive. Cambodia's neighbors in ASEAN chose to see a strategic buffer state where they should have seen a slaughterhouse, treating the genocide as a convenient internal affair. And when it was all over, the West, led by the US and UK, picked the Khmer Rouge up from the dustbin of history, laundered their image in a coalition of convenience, and propped them up with covert aid, all to bleed a geopolitical rival. At every single stage, the suffering of the Cambodian people was a known variable, a documented fact that was weighed against strategic interests and deemed an acceptable cost. This is the secret doctrine of power, the unspoken truth that underpins so much of international relations. It is the philosophy that allows for the sacrifice of a nation for the sake of a decent interval, or the arming of a genocidal cult to counter a rival. It's a worldview that is never publicly admitted, but it is the engine of history. This is our final uncomfortable quote, the secret motto of the great game. History is not written by the just, but by the powerful. Morality is a luxury for those who are not responsible for the survival and dominance of a nation. States do not have friends or principles, they have interests, and the suffering of those who are caught between the pursuit of those interests is, and always will be a regrettable but ultimately acceptable price of doing business. An acceptable price. That is the final damning verdict. The Cambodian people were the price. The 2 million dead were the cost of America's withdrawal from Vietnam, the cost of China's rivalry with the Soviet Union, the cost of Thailand's border security, the cost of the UN's commitment to a flawed and cynical legalism. The lingering shadow of this grand impunity is the terrifying precedent it sets. It demonstrates that a superpower can enable a genocide and not only get away with it, but suffer no meaningful consequences. This knowledge erodes the very foundation of international law and human rights. It whispers a terrible truth into the ears of modern tyrants. If you are strategically useful enough, you can get away with anything. The full, dark truth of the Khmer Rouge is not just that a group of fanatics murdered their own people. It's that the world watched and in many cases helped them do it. The final outcome for Cambodia was a shattered country, a traumatized people, and a fragile peace haunted by the ghosts of the unpunished. The history is real, but the true story is never the official one. What we've laid out here is a synthesis of the facts, the cables, the policies, the secret handshakes, that reveal the paradoxes and moral compromises that official narratives are designed to hide. The truth is that great crimes are rarely the product of a single monster. They are the product of a system of indifference, of cynicism, and of the cold, hard logic of power that deems certain people expendable. We encourage you to dig deeper, to question what you've been told, and to share your own research and thoughts in the comments below. The story is never truly over as long as the full truth remains buried, and that's the truth they tried to bury. Until next time, always question the official story.